Hey guys, tonight we ease into something both grand and strangely soothing. The entire life of Empress Zetian, the only woman to ever rule China outright as emperor. Imagine a sprawling palace lit by flickering oil lamps, silk banners swaying, and faint incense smoke curling up like sleepy clouds. You're not sprinting into this story. You're shuffling in, slippers dragging, carrying the weight of 1,000 years of gossip on your shoulders. And let's be honest, you probably won't survive this tale awake. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And since I'm nosy, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You picture the Tang dynasty like a half-remembered dream. Horse hooves on packed earth roads, bustling markets filled with spices from India, glass from Persia, and the constant murmur of a city that might rival any in the world. Chang'an, the capital, was a heartbeat of civilization, and it's here the stage is set for Zetian. The dynasty was young, its confidence fresh, and its rulers basked in power like cats in sunlight. You wanted the wide boulevards in your mind, lined with trees and watchtowers. Merchants unload boats of silk, and scholars argue over philosophy. There's music, a blend of foreign flutes and Chinese zither, drifting through tavern doors. At the edge of all this noise, in the shadows of high red walls, a child is born. She is not yet Empress Wu. She is simply Wu Zhao, a baby wrapped in fabric finer than most villagers would see in a lifetime. The year is 624 CE. Emperor Taizong, the formidable second ruler of the Tang, is already shaping his empire into a superpower. Somewhere in Shaanxi province, in a family of relative comfort, this girl's life begins. Historians still argue whether her family was noble or simply well-connected merchants, but either way, she had access to more books than bread. You picture her childhood. Ink-stained fingers, the scratch of brushes, endless Confucian classics read aloud until even a household cat could recite them. There's a quirky rumor that little Wu was unusually bold even as a child, correcting adults mid-lesson, tossing her own sharp opinions when most girls were expected to sit quiet like porcelain dolls. Some claimed she had a knack for handling horses better than her brothers. Imagine a 7-year-old girl adjusting reins, rolling her eyes at the stable hands, already acting like a boss. You smile at that image, and then yawn, because what else is new? China at this time was both chaotic and dazzling. The Tang dynasty was expanding its borders with armies that stretched supply lines across deserts and mountains. While inside the empire, poets were turning language into art. You can almost hear Li Bai's verses echoing faintly across time. Even though he wasn't born yet, the Tang would be his playground. For now, it's enough to know that Wu's early world was rich, noisy, and complicated. Her parents likely never imagined she would become more than a wife to some official. Yet the Tang court was a strange carousel. Emperors chose concubines not just from noble clans, but from families with clever daughters who might please the ruler. Wu's looks were described in flowery cliches. Skin like snow, hair like clouds, but her mind was a sharper blade. And you, lying there in your bed, can feel the pull of destiny creeping in. Let's pause and note one mainstream fact. Wu Zetian is remembered as the only female emperor in Chinese history. Not Empress Dowager, not regent hiding behind a curtain, but emperor, taking the male title Huangdi. That alone makes her life a gravity well in the historical record. Now, for a quirky tidbit, ancient Chinese cosmetics sometimes included powdered lead to whiten the face. It gave that ghostly porcelain look, but it also gave women, lead poisoning. Imagine Wu as a teenager, dabbing on makeup while unknowingly risking a headache worse than your Monday morning Zoom calls. Historians still argue whether beauty practices like these shorten lives at court or if it's just exaggerated gossip. As you drift through this opening, you picture young Wu standing on the balcony of her family's home, eyes scanning the horizon. Somewhere beyond the hills lies Chang'an, with its towering walls and guarded gates. The city is a promise and a threat, a place where she might fade into obscurity or seize the dragon throne itself. She doesn't know this yet, of course. Right now, she's still just a curious girl, tugging at the sleeve of a tutor, asking questions no one expects her to ask. The air smells faintly of pine resin and cooked millet porridge. Lanterns flicker, moths tapping at the paper. Time moves slowly, the way it always does when you're a child. You roll onto your side, hearing the echo of history in your ears, and wonder how much of destiny is written at birth and how much is scribbled recklessly along the way. If you close your eyes now, you can almost believe you're in the Tang capital yourself, drifting down those avenues under a sky peppered with stars. The crowd noises soften. The palace walls loom, and Wu's story begins to unfurl like a scroll unrolled at a scholar's desk. And just like that, you're sliding deeper into the night, with centuries of intrigue still ahead. You're still floating down the avenues of Chang'an, that colossal capital where every alley smells of ink, incense, and dumpling steam. Somewhere in this empire of constant chatter, Wu Zhao, later to be Wu Zetian, is only a baby, bundled and cooing. Tonight, though, you lean closer to her beginnings, because even in the quietest cradle, history sometimes snores itself awake. Wu Zhao's birth was not marked by dragon-shaped clouds or shooting stars. She wasn't the child of emperors, but of a family with enough wealth to afford education and silk bedding. Her father, Wu Shihua, was a merchant-turned-official who did well for himself under the Tang. Imagine him as that guy who starts with a little shop in the market, selling cloth, and somehow ends up managing the local tax office. Her mother came from the Yang clan, a name with weight in aristocratic circles. Between the two of them, Wu Zhao had a head start that most girls in the 7th century could only dream of. Historians still argue whether her family's nobility was truly noble or just well-polished networking. In Tang China, lineage was everything. If your family tree didn't sprout from the right branches, people looked down on you. Yet, when you're lying in bed thinking about it, maybe that's exactly what sharpened Wu's edge. She grew up hearing whispers that her family wasn't quite enough. And that kind of background either breaks a kid or makes her hungry. Guess which way she leaned? As a child, she likely ran around courtyards paved with gray stone, her tiny shoes slapping the ground while servants chased after her. She would have heard poetry recited at family banquets, seen her father come home with scrolls from the office, and smelled the strong tea poured for officials visiting their hall. One mainstream fact stands out. The Tang dynasty prided itself on education. For boys, yes. For girls, not so much. Yet Wu's father supposedly encouraged her to learn to read and write. That single decision was like handing a sharp blade to a curious toddler. Here's a quirky tidbit. Wu was said to have been fond of animals, particularly horses. Unlike most girls, she didn't just watch. She insisted on riding. There's a tale that by the time she was 13, she could manage a horse better than the stable boys, hair whipping behind her like she was born to it. Picture her, tiny hands clutching reins, smirking as a horse gallops across a dusty yard. Not your average embroidery-loving daughter. And while you're picturing her, remember, historians still debate whether these childhood anecdotes are truth or propaganda cooked up later to justify her rule. Was she really that bold from the start, or did scribes rewrite her origin story with hindsight, like the Marvel prequel nobody asked for? Night deepens around you as you trail her childhood. Her tutors probably drilled her in the Confucian classics, the ones that hammer home obedience and hierarchy. Imagine little Wu Zhao rolling her eyes at passages that say women should obey fathers, husbands, and sons in turn. She copies the characters carefully with her brush. But in her mind, she's already questioning why obedience should be life-sealing. Maybe you, tucked under your blanket, are asking the same thing. How many rules did you swallow as a kid without question? At home, she witnessed both comfort and ambition. Banquets with roasted duck and pickled vegetables might seem extravagant compared to what peasants ate, mostly millet gruel, but they were also reminders of status. Every feast was a performance, and Wu learned early that appearances mattered. Later, she would master the art of looking serene, while plotting 10 moves ahead, a skill that probably began when she was small and mimicking the graceful bows of her elders. By the time she reached her teenage years, she had already developed what one historian described as eyes that could pierce through silence. It's the kind of description that feels suspiciously poetic, but it paints a picture of a girl whose gaze lingered too long, who asked questions when silence was safer. At night, The lanterns burned low, and she might have sat awake, listening to the muted conversations of her parents, catching fragments about taxes, neighbors, and the emperor's officials. Each scrap of overheard adult talk sharpened her sense of the bigger world. Here's another odd fact for your sleepy brain. Wu's family lived in an age where astrology dictated everything from when to harvest millet to when to cut your nails. Her parents might have checked her horoscope before arranging her future, wondering whether the stars promised fortune or disaster. And you lying there, staring at your ceiling, know the punchline. The horoscope missed a spot. It didn't predict she'd one day run the whole empire. By around 14, she was ready for the next step, leaving the comfort of family life for the dazzling, dangerous Tang court. This wasn't just a move up. It was stepping onto a chessboard where every piece was alive and scheming. Imagine her standing at the gates of Chang'an, the city walls towering over her heart thumping beneath embroidered robes. Behind her lay the safe rhythms of childhood. Ahead was a palace filled with rivals, rules, and opportunities. You pull the blanket tighter, sensing the gravity of that moment. Childhood ended, and the path toward the throne began. Not with a crown, but with a girl daring to imagine she could climb higher than anyone believed possible. You drift further along, half asleep, into the dusty corridors of Wu Zhao's family story. Her roots, though not royal, were entangled with the swirling ambitions of the early Tang dynasty. Tonight, you let yourself sink into the foundations, the merchants, the officials, the ancestral claims that shaped the background against which you would eventually rise. Her father, Wu Shihua, looms in your imagination as a figure both practical and ambitious. Born into a family that was not aristocratic in the strict Confucian sense, he carved out a career as a timber merchant before catching the eye of the Tang court. Timber, after all, wasn't just firewood. It built palaces, temples, and the tools of empire. If you squint, you can almost see him tallying accounts under lamplight, planning shipments along the Yellow River, his mind already stretching toward politics. Eventually, his skill in logistics earned him official positions, climbing the ladder of provincial administration. Her mother, Lady Yang, brought something different, a bloodline with ties to one of the great clans of China. The Yangs weren't at the very top tier, but they gave Wu Zhao a touch of prestige. In an empire obsessed with genealogy, this mattered. When people whisper about her family being new money, the Yang connection gave the Wu household a slightly shinier polish. Still, historians still argue whether those Yang connections were as weighty as later chroniclers like to boast, or if it was more like claiming your great-uncle's cousin once knew somebody important. And there lies the central tension of her family background. Were the Wus true nobles, or were they wealthy outsiders sneaking into the party? The Tang dynasty was full of old aristocrats clinging to their pedigrees, eyeing upstart families with suspicion. To them, the Wus were ambitious climbers, eager to prove they belonged in elite circles. You can practically feel the judgmental side radiating through the centuries. Here's a mainstream fact. Wu Shihua was posthumously honored as the Duke of Ying by Emperor Gaozong, long after his daughter secured her throne. This retroactive promotion shows how lineage could be rewritten to suit politics. Suddenly, the timber merchant became the patriarch of a noble line, because what looked better on the resume of an empress? And a quirky tidbit for you. Records suggest the Wu family might claim descent from the Zhou dynasty kings, a dynastic flex that was about as believable as your neighbor insisting they're descended from Julius Caesar. Whether true or not, these lofty genealogical claims gave the family a patina of ancient respectability. Picture Wu Zhao as a teenager rolling her eyes at the family elder who kept bragging. We're descended from royalty, you know, while she secretly thought, I'll just make myself royalty instead. The family estate in Shaanxi likely buzzed with activity. Courtyards filled with servants pounding grain. Scholars reciting poetry in the study hall. Wu's mother supervising household rituals. Wu Zhao absorbed it all. The structure, the discipline, the subtle hierarchies. When guests visited, she watched how her father bowed slightly lower to officials of higher rank, how words were chosen carefully, how wine was poured at just the right angle. These small details, half boring and half hypnotic, laid the groundwork for her later mastery of court etiquette. At night, as the house quieted, Wu Zhao might have overheard her parents murmuring about opportunities at court, about the emperor's favor being the wind, that could carry a family higher. You imagine her lying in bed, eyes open in the dark, absorbing that hunger like incense smoke in her lungs. Historians still argue whether Wu Shihua actively groomed his daughter for court service, or if fate simply nudged her in that direction after his death. He passed away when she was a teenager, leaving Lady Yang and Wu Zhao to navigate the family's fortunes alone. Losing a father so young hardened her, teaching her the first of many lessons. Stability is fragile, and power must be seized before it slips away. By this point, you're nodding along with the rhythm of her family tale. Nothing explosive yet, no throne or scandal, just a quiet layering of context, like the foundation stones of pagoda. Without this, her later rise wouldn't make sense. Here's a modern comparison, because your drowsy brain probably needs one. Imagine Wu Zhao's family as the ambitious new tech startup on the block, disrupting an industry dominated by old firms with legacy clout. The aristocrats are the established companies with decades of reputation. The Wus are the newcomers with cash flow and hustle, daring to play the same game. It's no wonder her later enemies accuse her of being lowborn. It wasn't entirely about her gender, but about class. And while you drift deeper into this tapestry, keep in mind, every dynasty in China rose and fell on the balance of bloodlines and ability. The Wus were caught between the two, not fully embraced as noble, yet too powerful to ignore. That in-betweenness shaped Wu Zhao's outlook. To survive, she couldn't rely solely on family heritage. She had to prove herself, outthink rivals, and rewrite the very script of legitimacy. The air in her household would have been filled with ritual. The clang of bronze vessels during ancestral sacrifices, the smell of wine offered to forebears, the hushed prayers for fortune. You picture Wu Zhao kneeling beside her mother, hands folded, eyes darting to the flames that flickered during those ceremonies. Did she believe the ancestors were watching? Or did she already suspect that the only spirits who mattered were living men with power to grant her future? And as you sink into the pillow, remember that childhood in Shaanxi wasn't glamorous by modern standards. There were no fireworks of destiny at birth, no chorus of angels announcing her rise. Just a family climbing, grasping, whispering, laying the bricks of ambition on which she would one day stand taller than anyone thought possible. The story drifts onward, and you find yourself tiptoeing into Wu Zhao's early education, that quiet yet crucial stretch where scrolls, tutors, and stubborn curiosity shaped her mind. You imagine her as a little girl with ink-stained sleeves, staring at brushstrokes that look more like art than words, and realizing that mastering these lines might one day mean mastering people. Education in Tang China was a privilege, especially for girls. Most daughters of officials were taught embroidery, etiquette, maybe a smattering of poems to recite at banquets. But Wu's father, Wu Shihua, went further. He arranged for her to study the classics alongside her brothers. This wasn't a casual afterthought. It was a deliberate choice. A mainstream fact here. Tang society was unusually cosmopolitan and more open-minded compared to earlier dynasties, and girls from wealthy families sometimes received broader educations. Wu took full advantage of this cultural loophole. She learned the Analects of Confucius, reciting lines that praise obedience and hierarchy. You can practically hear her muttering, "Women must submit," before raising an eyebrow like, "Really?" Historians still argue whether she genuinely admired Confucian teachings or secretly resented them, but one thing's clear. She memorized every syllable, because knowing the rules was the first step to bending them. Her tutors also introduced her to history, the endless rise and fall of dynasties. Imagine a child flipping through tales of emperors who built empires only to lose them to corruption, betrayal, or famine. It must have been both terrifying and strangely comforting. If rulers could fall, maybe one day a girl could rise. Quirky tidbit time. Wu Zhao supposedly excelled in calligraphy, that meditative art where brush, ink, and paper merge into a dance. Tang calligraphy was so prized that officials could be judged on their handwriting. Imagine a young Wu carefully dipping her brush, strokes sharp and confident, while her brother's characters wobbled like tipsy ducks. It said her calligraphy had such force that one teacher remarked, "This girl writes like a man," which, back then, was somehow considered a compliment. But education wasn't just ink and scrolls. She learned music, plucking the pipa until the strings sang through courtyard walls. She absorbed poetry, because in Tang society, poetry wasn't just art, it was a ticket into elite circles. Later, candidates for government office would be tested on their poetic skills in the civil service exam. Wu must have realized that words weren't simply decoration. They were weapons and ladders. Her childhood days probably oscillated between strict study and bursts of freedom. Picture her sneaking out to watch horsemen practicing the yard, memorizing the movements, thinking about balance and control, or standing on a balcony at dusk, repeating verses about loyalty and virtue, while secretly imagining her own name in those histories. Education also carried ritual. Lessons often began with bows to Confucius, to ancestors, to the spirits of wisdom. Incense burned, creating the heavy, sweet scent that clung to robes. Wu Zhao would have grown used to kneeling, standing, bowing, movements drilled into muscle memory. Later, when she presided over ceremonies as Empress, those same gestures flowed from her with effortless grace. There's also the edge of rebellion here. Tang women, while more independent than in earlier eras, were still expected to remain modest, obedient, and invisible beyond the domestic sphere. Wu's sharpness stood out. Stories say she was quick to challenge tutors, asking questions most girls swallowed back. Did her teachers find her annoying? Probably. Did she care? Probably not. That streak of curiosity was dangerous in a world that demanded compliance. And yet, lying there in your bed, you can almost hear the quiet scratch of brushes on paper, the monotone voices reciting lines, the distant clatter of kitchen pots. It's not dramatic, not scandalous. It's the everyday hum of a life being prepared. It's boring history, the kind that lulls you toward sleep, but boring the way soil is boring, full of hidden roots that will grow into something massive. Historians still argue how much of her education was formal and how much was self-driven. Some account portray her as practically a prodigy, while others hint she simply soaked up whatever was available like a sponge in a library. Either way, she emerged with an intellect sharper than most courtiers she'd later face. And you wonder, as you settle deeper into your pillow, whether any of her tutors sensed what they were shaping. Did they ever suspect that the girl frowning over her brushstrokes would one day dictate laws to the empire? Or did they simply pat her on the head, murmur about her diligence, and shuffle back to their tea? The education of Wu Zhao wasn't a thunderclap. It was a steady drizzle, a quiet persistence. Page after page, stroke after stroke, lesson after lesson. It's the kind of groundwork you almost overlook, until centuries later you realize the world tilted because of it. The scroll of time unrolls a little further, and now you're watching Wu Zhao drift into her teenage years. A liminal zone where childhood innocence mixes awkwardly with the creeping whispers of adulthood. The Tang dynasty's capital hums in the distance like a restless bee, and Wu, perched on the edge of possibility, starts to notice the faint vibrations of palace rumors. Teenagers, whether in the 7th century or now, always find themselves surrounded by gossip. For Wu Zhao, though, the gossip wasn't about who borrowed whose hairpin or who sang off-key at the poetry recital. Her world already brushed up against the gravitational pull of the Tang court, and palace whispers carried weight that could shape destinies. Imagine Wu, around 14 or 15, hearing her mother's friends murmur about concubines chosen from talented households, about girls brought to serve the emperor's vast harem. Instead of shrinking at the idea, she might have leaned closer, ears pricked, mind already calculating. Here's a mainstream fact. Tang emperors maintained enormous harems, with ranks and titles for hundreds of women. These weren't just companions. They were political pawns. Families offered daughters in hopes of climbing the ladder of influence. So when Wu Zhao's name started floating in the same breath as palace, it was both an honor and a looming risk. But let's add a quirky tidbit. Tang teenagers weren't exactly scrolling TikTok, but they did enjoy amusement. Board games like Liubo were common, involving sticks and dice, with rules so complicated most modern historians can't fully reconstruct them. Picture Wu Zhao, in her embroidered robe, beating her cousins at a game while smirking, skill not luck, as if destiny itself were already stacked in her favor. Meanwhile, her education continued. Poetry recitals in family halls became chances to show off. She likely recited lines not just with memorization, but with a flair that hinted at confidence. Every brushstroke in her calligraphy carried an unspoken challenge. I am not ordinary. Her mother, Lady Yong, may have worried. A girl too bold, too noticeable, could just as easily attract punishment as opportunity. Yet by now, Wu's personality had sharpened into something impossible to dim. Historians still argue whether she was selected for the palace because of her looks, her intellect, or her family's political maneuvering. The official line? Beauty. Wu Zhao was described with the usual cliches. Skin like jade, hair like a cloud, eyes that sparkle with mystery. But beauty alone never sustained anyone long in the harem. More likely, the Wu family saw a chance and nudged her toward it, polishing her education, preparing her for life behind red lacquered doors. As you drift along, imagine her walking the family garden at dusk, listening to cicadas, robe trailing softly over gravel. She knows change is coming. The Tang capital, with its soaring gates and bustling markets, calls to her. The palace is both promise and trap. But for a girl who's been raised on stories of emperors and destiny, the lure is irresistible. Her teenage years were not marked by rebellion in the modern sense. No sneaking out at rock concerts, no dyeing her hair blue, but she had her own brand of defiance. Tang etiquette demanded quiet compliance from daughters. Wu offered curiosity and presence instead. Guests noticed her. Tutors complained she argued too much. Servants whispered that she carried herself like someone expecting more from life than sewing silk or serving tea. At night, she might have sat by candlelight, brushing ink across paper, forming lines of poetry she never shared. Tang society adored poetry competitions, and Wu no doubt realized the value of words, not just for art, but for survival. Later, she'd use this skill to elevate her reign, surrounding herself with poets whose verses reinforced her legitimacy. But the seeds were planted now, in those quiet teenage hours, when the world still seemed wide open. You, lying in the dark, might recognize the strange electricity of being that age, when every rumor feels like a portal, when the horizon is a place you long to chase. Wu Zhao stood on the brink of that horizon, sensing that her teenage days in Shaanxi were numbered. Some sources suggest she even expressed early disdain for the limited roles of women, murmuring to friends that she wanted more than marriage. Whether or not the line is authentic, you can't help but smirk. It sounds like the kind of thing later historians wrote into her backstory. Teenage Wu declaring, "Why settle for weaving when I could weave the empire?" It might be myth, but myths often carry a grain of truth. The court was calling, and her teenage ears were tuned to its frequency. Soon, messengers and officials would bring word. The palace wanted her. She'd trade familiar courtyards for endless halls, family dinners for ritual banquets, freedom for the glittering cage of the Tang harem. She was still young, still untested, but already her name was on the lips of those who mattered. And so, as you pull the blanket closer and her eyelids droop, imagine her last quiet nights at home. The stars overhead, the steady hum of insects, her mother adjusting her hair while giving 1,000 small warnings. Wu Zhao, still a teenager, was about to step into history's harshest spotlight. The air in your imagination grows heavier, as if perfumed with incense and anxiety. Because now Wu Zhao takes her first deliberate steps toward the palace. This is a threshold moment where she stops being just another ambitious teenager and becomes a concubine in the court of Emperor Taizong. You picture her standing in a long line of carefully dressed girls, robes embroidered with cranes and peonies, faces powdered pale, waiting for a future none of them fully understand. Becoming a concubine wasn't a casual affair. It wasn't like getting invited to a party. It was more like being absorbed into a living machine where every rank, every gesture, and every glance mattered. Taizong, the second emperor of the Tang dynasty, had already established himself as one of the great rulers. Military victories, administrative reforms, and a kind of stern charisma that filled annals with praise. To serve him was considered an honor, though honor, in this case, meant living under constant scrutiny. One mainstream fact: Wu Zhao entered the palace around the age of 14, joining as a Chiron, a fifth-rank concubine. Low in status compared to empresses and higher consorts, but still inside the golden cage of imperial life. Think of it as being the new intern in an office where the CEO also happens to control the lives of millions. Here's a quirky tidbit. In Tang times, concubines were often given nicknames or tasks to distinguish them. Wu Zhao, being young and sharp, was reportedly put in charge of caring for the emperor's library and clothing. Imagine her folding imperial robes while sneaking peeks at the scrolls of military history or philosophical debates. While others might have treated the task as drudgery, Wu probably treated it like free university, absorbing statecraft while smoothing out creases in silk. But life in the harem wasn't a rosy dream. Historians still argue whether Wu was ever favored by Taizong himself. Some chronicles say she attracted his attention with wit and intelligence, while others insist she remained a minor figure, barely noticed until later. Either way, she wasn't the top of the pyramid. She was one among hundreds, navigating a labyrinth of jealousy, rituals, and endless rules. The palace itself was overwhelming. You wander through in your mind. Enormous courtyards that echoed with the tramp of guards, long corridors where whispers slithered like snakes, and gardens so carefully manicured they looked artificial. Every step Wu took was a performance. Bow here, glance down there, never walk too quickly. Concubines lived in a world of silk curtains and sharpened smiles, where alliances were forged over cups of tea and ruined by a single misplaced word. You, lying there in the quiet, can feel how suffocating it must have been. Hundreds of women, all competing for one man's attention, all watched by eunuchs who reported everything back to the emperor. And somewhere among them, Wu Zhao sharpened her patience, learning to play the long game. Picture her at night, sitting by the dim glow of an oil lamp, copying out lines of poetry or tracing characters with her finger on the table. Around her, the palace slept fitfully, but she kept her mind busy, storing away every lesson, every rumor, every tiny piece of leverage she could use later. Concubines weren't entirely powerless. They influenced fashion, rituals, and even the emperor's mood. But the ladder to true authority was steep, and many women spent their whole lives in obscurity, their names forgotten. Wu, though, wasn't built for obscurity. The very act of surviving in Taizong's harem, without fading into silence, was itself a preparation. One image lingers. Emperor Taizong, stern and commanding, walking past her one evening in the palace library. Maybe he stopped, asked her to read a passage aloud, curious about her voice. Maybe he barely glanced at her. The records are unclear, but the fact remains, Wu learned under his roof, in his world, among his officials, and she would one day wield what she absorbed there like a blade. You turn slightly under your blanket, imagining the contrast. Outside the palace walls, markets bustle with traders selling peppers and glass beads. Children chase each other through alleys, and farmers prayed for rain. Inside, Wu Zhao sat under carved beams, waiting for opportunities measured in decades. The world outside moved in seasons. Her world moved in subtle nods and hushed conversations. It's almost funny, in a sleepy way. The girl who once raced horses in her family yard now found herself adjusting to a life where her every step was choreographed. Freedom shrank, but ambition quietly grew. The palace had swallowed her, yes, but it hadn't digested her yet. And so, as you drift deeper into the night, you see her in that palace corridor, her hair pinned high, her eyes alert. Just another concubine on the surface. But already, beneath the layers of silk, a story was stirring that would shake an empire. The palace doesn't sleep, not really. Even when the oil lamps gutter low and the gardens lie cloaked in moonlight, the Tang harem hums with unease, and Wu Zhao is now part of it. Tonight you drift beside her through those first bewildering months as one of Emperor Taizong's concubines, discovering what life in the harem meant. Endless rituals, silken prisons, and a competition sharper than any blade. The harem was organized like a bureaucracy of beauty. Dozens of ranks defined who got what chamber, how many maids attended them, and even how often they might see the emperor. A mainstream fact. The Tang imperial harem at its height could house several thousand women, from empress to low-ranking attendants. Wu entered this maze near the bottom rung, a Chiron, and had to navigate upwards through grace, wit, and sheer survival. Imagine the routines. At dawn, eunuchs rapped on doors to wake concubines. Servants brought trays of rice porridge and pickled greens. Then came grooming. Powdered faces, brushed hair, robes straightened until folds fell with mathematical precision. By mid-morning, women filed into ceremonies, some religious, some courtly, some simply for show. Every movement was codified, bow 3 times, speak only when addressed, walk neither too slow nor too fast. Life was an endless etiquette exam where failure meant exile to obscurity. And yet, tucked in this monotonous rhythm, Wu Zhao studied. She watched older concubines gossip and scheme. She noted which eunuchs were loyal, which ones leaked secrets. She even learned the art of silence. The way to hold her tongue could make others underestimate her. You, lying in bed now, can almost hear the rustle of silk sleeves, the clink of jade hairpins, the endless shuffle of feet across polished stone floors. Here's a quirky tidbit to make you smile before drifting off. Tang court ladies use elaborate perfumes, sometimes blended with odd ingredients like musk from deer glands or even powdered seashells. Imagine Wu Zhao wrinkling her nose at the stronger concoctions, thinking, if I ever rule this place, I'm banning deer gland perfume. But the glamour masked fear. The harem wasn't just women waiting prettily. It was a crucible of rivalry. Empress Wang, Taizong's official wife, wielded the highest authority, and she didn't take kindly to newcomers with ambition. Wu, though low-ranked, had something different, intelligence that made her stand out. Historians still argue whether Taizong himself noticed her wit, or whether she remained in the background during his reign, absorbing knowledge like a quiet sponge. Either way, life in the harem was a constant test. Meals were political. Who sat where, who was served first, even which dishes you dare to eat. It all sent signals. A wrong move could mean being cut off from imperial favor, or worse, accused of treachery. Wu Zhao learned to smile when required, to lower her eyes without lowering her mind. Nights were quieter but not peaceful. Concubines waited in chambers, wondering if the emperor would summon them. Wu Zhao, young and still untested, may have spent many evenings untouched by Taizong's attention, left to write poetry in her mind while candles burned low. Was she disappointed or secretly relieved? Historians still argue about how much affection she actually had for Taizong, or if her true connection would bloom later with his son, Gaozong. By now, you can sense the atmosphere of suffocation. Hundreds of women chasing one man's gaze, all under the watchful eyes of eunuchs who carried gossip like wildfire. Wu Zhao adapted. She didn't try to outshine everyone immediately. Instead, she bided her time, storing up knowledge. Later chronicles claim she memorized military texts while managing the emperor's robes, as if destiny was already in training. Even if embellished, the idea rings true. She was never just waiting. Think of it like a game of chess where most pieces never move. The pawns crowd the board, silent, hopeful. Wu Zhao wasn't yet a queen, but she was already planning her diagonals. You roll over, sensing the soft lull of this part of her life. It's not yet the thrilling power grabs, not yet the ruthless maneuvers, just the quiet apprenticeship of a woman who pretended to be ordinary while her mind wandered to extraordinary places. And in those silent palace nights, with cicadas buzzing faintly outside the walls, Wu Zhao must have stared at the carved beams overhead and whispered to herself, there must be more than this. The palace yawns into another day, and you follow Wu Zhao deeper into the monotony of service, her official duties as a concubine under Emperor Taizong. If yesterday's whispers were about jealousy and perfume, today's are about work, though work here meant the kind of ritualized chores that seemed boring on the surface but taught her how an empire ticked. Wu Zhao's assigned tasks were humble but revealing, a mainstream fact. Fifth-rank concubines like her often handled practical duties, and Wu was reportedly in charge of the emperor's clothing and some library materials. Imagine her carefully folding dragon-embroidered robes, running her fingers across silk as smooth as water, noting which garments Taizong favored for councils, which he wore on hunts, and which he donned for sacrifices. Clothes in Tang China weren't just fashion. They were coded messages of rank, ritual, and authority. By touching these garments daily, Wu was literally brushing against power. The library duties were even more intriguing. Concubines helped sort and preserve scrolls, which sounds tedious until you realize these scrolls contain histories, strategies, and philosophies. Wu Zhao may have spent hours dusting shelves, but she was also absorbing knowledge line by line. You picture her sneaking an extra glance at a text on military campaigns, memorizing passages while eunuchs assumed she was just tidying up. It was the kind of stealth education no tutor could have arranged. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Tang court had strict rules for how to handle imperial books. If a concubine damaged a scroll, say by spilling tea or smudging ink, she could be punished with lashes or even dismissal. So picture Wu Zhao, hand steady as a surgeon's, telling herself not to sneeze while unrolling a fragile manuscript. Somehow, she not only avoided mistakes but thrived in that careful environment. Historians still argue whether these accounts of her diligence were embellished after she rose to power. Some suggest chroniclers invented the image of her as an industrious bookworm to contrast with her later critics who called her manipulative. But whether true or exaggerated, the narrative of Wu the scholar concubine stuck, and it explains why later ministers grudgingly respected her intelligence. Daily duties also meant endless ceremonies. Concubines attended sacrifices, seasonal festivals, and banquets, where they served dishes and refilled cups. Wu Zhao likely memorized which officials sat where, which ministers whispered behind their sleeves, and which generals boasted too loudly after a few cups of wine. These banquets weren't entertainment. They were intelligence gathering disguised as ritual. Even the kitchen smells mattered. Roasted duck with plum sauce, steaming bowls of millet, the tang of garlic and ginger, all drifting into the halls where Wu Zhao walked silently with trays. She wasn't feasting. She was watching. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the clatter of chopsticks, the drone of poetry recitals, the sharp laughter of courtiers too comfortable in their power. Nights brought another layer of responsibility. When the emperor traveled, concubines helped prepare his chambers, arranging pillows, laying out robes, ensuring incense burned with the right fragrance. Imagine Wu Zhao smoothing sheets while eunuchs set out bronze vessels, the flicker of lamplight casting long shadows on carved screens. She wasn't yet the star of the show, but she was in the room where the script was written. And let's not forget the subtle theater of competition. Other concubines jostled for small advantages. Who poured wine with more elegance? Who wore the most flattering robe? Who recited poetry with perfect rhythm? Wu Zhao observed all of this, deciding when to blend in and when to let her sharpness show. Survival meant knowing when silence spoke louder than words. From your bed, you can almost feel the weight of her patience. Hours spent polishing jade ornaments, adjusting silk hangings, or copying lists of offerings. Tasks so dull they put most people to sleep. And here you are, drifting to, lulled by the thought of endless scrolls and robes. But Wu Zhao's mind didn't drift. She was laying bricks in her inner fortress, stone by stone, each duty teaching her how power was woven into every thread of palace life. One day she would wield these lessons like weapons, but for now, she performed them with the calm precision of someone hiding ambition under layers of obedience. Historians still argue whether Emperor Taizong ever noticed her intelligence during this period. Some say he occasionally quizzed her on passages of history, amused by her quick answers. Others claim she remained invisible, a shadow flitting in the background as rain. Whichever version you believe, the truth is this: Wu Zhao was learning. And sometimes learning quietly is more dangerous than shouting loudly. So as you sink into your pillow, picture her one last time, seated in the palace library at dusk, a scroll unrolled before her brush scratching quietly across paper as if copying words into her soul. Around her, the palace fades into silence. But inside, the furnace of her ambition glows just a little hotter. The palace corridors grow even quieter as your imagination trails into a subtler corner of Wu Zhao's life. Those first meetings, those flickering glances, exchanged with the young crown prince, Li Ji, the man who would become Emperor Gaozong. It wasn't fireworks. Not yet. More like the quiet spark of recognition when two people in a crowded room realize they see each other differently than the rest. One mainstream fact. Wu Zhao served in Emperor Taizong's court, but she was close in age to his son, the crown prince. Li Ji was younger than Wu by a few years, soft-spoken, and less commanding than his stern father. Court chronicles paint him as gentle, even indecisive, a man easily influenced. For a woman as sharp as Wu, that combination must have looked less like weakness and more like opportunity. Imagine the scene. The prince enters a library where Wu is folding robes or dusting scrolls. He lingers, pretending to examine texts, though his eyes drift toward her. She bows, as protocol demands, but maybe just a fraction more slowly, long enough for him to catch the gleam in her gaze. No words are exchanged beyond a ritual, yet the silence is thick with possibility. Here's a quirky tidbit. Palace etiquette dictated that servants and concubines avoid prolonged eye contact with royalty. So, those stolen glances weren't just teenage-style crush moments. They were low-level acts of defiance. Every glance was a risk. Imagine Wu Zhao calculating it like a move in chess, just long enough to intrigue, not long enough to be accused of impropriety. Historians still argue whether their attraction began during Taizong's reign, or whether later storytellers invented it to justify their eventual marriage. Some claim Wu and Li Ji secretly bonded over shared interests, poetry, history, music, while others insist it's pure romanticized myth. But the detail that sticks again and again is that their paths crossed often enough to plant seeds that would blossom once Taizong was gone. For now, Wu Zhao had to tread carefully. She was still Taizong's concubine, after all, and any whiff of scandal could have been catastrophic. You imagine her arranging the emperor's robes with perfect composure while feeling the prince's eyes on her back, or standing during ceremonies, reciting chants with the other women. While sensing Li Ji standing across the hall, both of them locked into ritual, yet aware of each other in ways they couldn't express. Life in a harem was already a battlefield, but this subtle connection added another layer. It was like discovering a secret door in a house full of locked chambers. Did Wu feel affection for Li Ji, or was it purely pragmatic? You, curled under your blanket, might lean toward romance, but remember, in court life, even romance was strategy. Outside these hushed exchanges, the palace churned on. Eunuchs barked orders. Incense smoke curled in temple halls. Ministers jostled for the emperor's ear. Wu Zhao continued her routine, robes, scrolls, ceremonies. But now, her awareness expanded. She wasn't only learning the habits of Taizong. She was studying his heir. Another odd thought drifts in. Tang palaces were full of animals, trained falcons, prize horses, even exotic creatures from foreign envoys. Imagine Wu Zhao and the prince crossing paths in the stables, both pretending to admire a spirited horse while sneaking sidelong looks. A clumsy moment. Maybe one of them stepping in something best left undescribed, and both suppressing laughter. That small human crack in the stiff wall of etiquette may have been more powerful than any grand gesture. Historians still argue whether Taizong suspected anything. Some suggest he deliberately kept Wu Zhao close to the prince to sharpen Li Ji's education, since Wu was known for her intelligence. Others say Taizong barely noticed, distracted by his own aging body and the demands of empire. Whatever the truth, Wu Zhao walked a razor's edge, gathering experience on the emperor while quietly sketching out the possibilities of a different future. And so, as the night deepens around you, you imagine Wu Zhao walking through a moonlit corridor, carrying a tray of robes. She hears footsteps behind her, the prince. They don't speak. They don't need to. Just the echo of two sets of footsteps, parallel but not yet joined, whispering of the empire-shaking partnership that lies ahead. You yawn, sensing how quiet this chapter is, almost like the calm before a storm. The glances are fleeting, the conversations almost non-existent, but already the seeds of destiny are there, planted in silence, waiting to sprout when history tilts. You find yourself wandering down the dim halls of the Tang Palace, where the air feels heavier, as if carrying the weight of an emperor's declining breath. This is a part of Wu Zhao's story where the man she officially served, Emperor Taizong, begins to falter. It's not dramatic lightning bolts or sudden collapse, but slow erosion, like sand sliding away under a wall. And Wu, still a young concubine, watches carefully, learning what happens when a dragon on the throne loses its fire. A mainstream fact. By the late 640s, Taizong's health began to decline. He suffered from lingering ailments, some described as fevers, others as complications from old injuries sustained in his campaigns. The chronicles mention strokes and paralysis, leaving him less able to ride at the head of his armies. For a ruler once celebrated as a warrior emperor, it was a humiliating retreat from vigor to fragility. Wu Zhao, low in rank, wasn't in the room for every diagnosis or whispered counsel, but she saw the effects. Ceremonies became shorter. Banquets ended earlier. Ministers left chambers with more furrowed brows and smiles. The palace shifted its rhythm to accommodate an emperor who was no longer invincible. And yet, even illness didn't soften the atmosphere. The harem remained a stage for rivalry. The officials outside continued their scheming, and rumors thickened like incense smoke. Here's a quirky tidbit. Tang doctors sometimes prescribed odd remedies, like ground-up pearls dissolved in wine or crocodile gallbladders mixed into tonics. Imagine Taizong grimacing at a cup of what might as well have been reptile smoothie, while Wu Zhao, standing in the background, kept her face still as stone. Historians still argue how much access Wu had to the emperor in his final years. Some claim she became more visible, perhaps tending to his robes or reading texts aloud when his eyes weakened. Others insist she remained obscure, her real bond forming later with his son, the crown prince. But whether close or distant, she absorbed one lesson. Emperors could weaken, and when they did, the palace vultures circled fast. The atmosphere grew tense. Officials whispered about succession. Taizong had many sons, but Li Ji, the crown prince, was a designated heir. He was known for gentleness rather than strength, and many doubted whether he could hold the empire together. Wu Zhao, having already traded glances with him, must have noticed his quiet presence in these uneasy days. While Taizong coughed into his sleeves, the future shuffled nervously at the edges of the throne room. Life in the harem mirrored this decline. Nights once punctuated by lively banquets dulled into silence. The music of zither faded, replaced by the shuffling of eunuchs carrying medicines. Wu Zhao continued her duties, still folding robes and managing scrolls, but now the garment she touched smelled faintly of herbs and damp sweat. Even the emperor's dragon-embroidered silks hung looser on his frame. You, drifting in your bed, can feel the sadness of the stage, the slow unraveling of a man once larger than life. The Tang dynasty under Taizong had conquered vast lands, silenced rivals, and projected strength. Now, behind palace walls, the great conqueror became just another human, vulnerable to the same frailties as any farmer in a distant village. There's a story, perhaps exaggerated, of Taizong asking for a Buddhist monk to chant sutras in his chamber as he weakened. Whether true or not, it reflects the anxiety of a ruler facing mortality. Wu Zhao, if she overheard such prayers, would have marked the moment. The emperor who once bent the world to his will now hope for mercy from the heavens. And here lies the irony. You could almost chuckle for your drowsiness. Wu Zhao's presence in Taizong's court wasn't her grand moment. She wasn't remembered as his beloved, nor did she rise dramatically during his reign. She was, in a way, a background character in his final act. But sometimes the background is where the seeds of the next act are sown. Historians still argue whether Taizong himself sensed anything about her future. Some suggest he warned Li Ji to avoid her, suspicious of her intelligence. Others say he paid her no mind. Either way, as his body failed, her story was quietly preparing for a sharp turn. So imagine it. The emperor lies in his chamber, attended by physicians and anxious ministers. Outside, the courtyards are hushed. Concubines shuffle through routines more out of habit than joy. Wu Zhao adjusts her robe, lowers her gaze, and walks steadily down a corridor. She knows that soon the palace will change. She doesn't know exactly how yet, but she feels in the air, like a storm pressing at the horizon. And as you close your eyes, you too can feel that heaviness. The dying embers of one reign and the faint stir of another waiting patiently in the shadows. The palace air turns colder now, not just from the emperor's failing health, but from the shifting rituals that followed. Wu Zhao, once a minor concubine in Emperor Taizong's service, suddenly finds her life turned upside down by a tradition that sounds almost absurd to your sleepy ears. When an emperor died, the women of his harem who hadn't borne children were often sent away, not to retirement villas with lakeside views, but to Buddhist convents. A mainstream fact. After Taizong's death in 649, Wu Zhao, still in her early 20s, was sent to a convent in Chang'an. The logic was simple but ruthless. These women had belonged to the emperor, and propriety demanded they be cut off from worldly men. They shaved their heads, donned coarse robes, and were expected to live as nuns. Imagine going from silk sheets and lacquered halls to cold stone floors and chanting at dawn. That a downgrade no palace perfume could cover up. The convent walls must have echoed with sighs. Hundreds of young women, once brushed and perfumed, now found themselves scrubbing floors and chanting sutras. Wu Zhao, who had spent her adolescence in silks, suddenly felt the rough scratch of hemp cloth on her skin, the sting of cold water during ablutions. Her luxurious hair, once an asset in the harem, was cut away. You, nestled in your warm blanket, might shiver just imagining the drafty stone cells where she now slept. Here's a quirky tidbit. Tang nuns sometimes use powdered sandalwood not just for incense, but also as a kind of dry shampoo to keep their shaved scalps fragrant. Picture Wu Zhao, once admired for her elaborate hair, now rubbing sandalwood dust into bare skin, muttering that it wasn't exactly the beauty treatment she'd hoped for. Historians still argue how much she embraced or resented this enforced monastic life. Some say she devoted herself earnestly to chanting, absorbing Buddhist teachings that she would later use to bolster her rule. Others suggest she seethed in silence, plotting her way back into the world of power. Either way, the convent was not an end for her. It was an intermission. Life in the convent wasn't entirely bleak. Wu Zhao had time to think, to reflect, and perhaps to refine her inner resolve. The daily rhythm, bells at dawn, chanting sutras, silent meals of plain rice and vegetables, slowed her down, but also gave her clarity. She learned patience here, the kind that would later serve her well in political maneuvering. But the palace was never far away. During ceremonies, members of the imperial family sometimes visited temples, and it was during one such visit that fate cracked the door back open. Li Ji, now Emperor Gaozong, encountered Wu Zhao again. Whether by chance or by carefully staged encounter, the two were reunited. Imagine that moment. Wu Zhao in plain nun's robes, head shaved, eyes lowered, but the spark between them rekindled. In a sea of chanting nuns, one pair of eyes locked across incense smoke. You smiled drowsily at the thought. The romance angle is tempting, isn't it? Historians still argue whether their reunion was driven by genuine affection, or whether Wu Zhao cleverly positioned herself for the prince now emperor to notice her. But either way, she wasn't forgotten. Gaozong remembered, and remembering was enough. For now, though, she remained in monastic exile, enduring the monotony. Day after day, prayers hummed like bees, meals were tasteless, and freedom was just a rumor. Yet even in that monotony, Wu Zhao sharpened her mind. She had lost her silks, her hair, and her status, but she had not lost herself. You can almost hear the bells of the convent tolling through the mist, slow and steady, each note blending into the next. Wu Zhao walks barefoot along cold stone, chanting words that promise transcendence, while her heart clings stubbornly to the world she intends to reclaim. And as you drift deeper towards sleep, you sense that this chapter isn't about defeat. It's about waiting. Sometimes exile is just a pause before a louder return. Wu Zhao, shaven-headed and cloaked in gray, was still very much alive inside. The convent bells are still ringing faintly in your ears when the story stirs again. Wu Zhao, now cloaked in plain robes, her once glorious hair shaved away, had seemed destined to fade into the endless chanting of Buddhist sutras. But fate, or maybe cunning, pulled her back towards silken power. This is the moment where her story jolts back onto the palace stage. Gaozong, the crown prince who became emperor, remembered her. A mainstream fact. After Emperor Taizong's death in 649, his son Li Ji ascended as Emperor Gaozong. And not long after, during one of his visits to temples, he encountered Wu Zhao again. The accounts vary wildly. Some say it was pure coincidence. Gaozong entered the temple. Wu Zhao lifted her eyes, and the memory of their glances years before returned. Others suggest it was orchestrated, that Wu Zhao positioned herself carefully, ensuring she would be noticed in her nun's robes, a living reminder of their earlier connection. Either way, the result was the same. Gaozong wanted her back. This wasn't just a simple reunion. Imperial law technically forbade an emperor from taking his father's concubines. It was considered a breach of filial piety, a Confucian nightmare. Historians still argue how Gaozong justified it. Was it pure desire that overrode tradition, or was Wu Zhao persuasive enough to twist the rules in her favor? Either way, the scandal risked angering court officials and Empress Wang, Gao Zong's wife. But rules bend under the weight of will, and Wu Zhao's was like tempered steel. Here's a quirky tidbit. When Gao Zong officially recalled Wu Zhao to the palace, her hair had to be regrown. Court ladies often used herbal tonics of sesame oil and black beans to stimulate hair growth. You can imagine Wu Zhao enduring sticky concoctions rubbed into her scalp, muttering that the price of power sometimes smelled worse than crocodile gallbladder medicine. Back in the palace, the atmosphere was no less suffocating than before, but Wu Zhao had changed. The years in the convent had taught her patience, silence, and how to appear harmless while planning boldly. She re-entered not as a naive girl, but as a woman sharpened by loss and ambition. This time, she wasn't a fade into the background. At first, her return created waves of gossip. Ministers frowned. Court ladies whispered. Empress Wang, who had her own rival in Consort Xiao, now faced an even more dangerous competitor. And Wu Zhao, stepping lightly across polished floors once again, knew exactly what she was walking into. The harem was a battlefield, and she had just rearmed herself. Historians still argue whether Gao Zong's affection for her was love or manipulation. Some records describe him as genuinely smitten, finding in Wu Zhao a confidant more intelligent than anyone else in his court. Others claim she skillfully played the role of perfect partner, feeding his insecurities and bolstering his authority, while quietly tightening her own grip. The truth is probably somewhere in between, a mix of genuine attraction and cold strategy. Imagine the moment she first stood before Gao Zong again, no longer in gray robes but restored to silks, her hair pinned high once more. He might have smiled, relieved to have her back. She might have bowed, eyes lowered, hiding the fire that burned behind them. To outsiders, it looked like a reunion of affection. To Wu Zhao, it was a reopening of a door she'd once thought slammed forever. This return wasn't just personal. It was political. By aligning with Gao Zong, Wu Zhao positioned herself at the heart of power. Every small favor, every private conversation, every suggestion she whispered in his ear was a step closer to authority. She had endured exile, tasted silence, and now she was determined never to lose her voice again. And so, as you lie there with a hum of your fan, echoing the convent bells, picture Wu Zhao walking back through the palace gates. The same corridors, the same jade tiles, but she is no longer the same woman. She has learned that the world can strip her of silks, hair, and titles, but it cannot strip her of resolve. The palace swallows her once again, but this time she is not content to be swallowed. She is ready to reshape the walls from the inside. The palace gates close behind her, and now the tension sharpens. Wu Zhao is back among the silks and carved beams, but she no longer plays the wide-eyed concubine. She's older, steadier, and carrying scars no one can see. And directly in her path stand the women who already hold the emperor's attention. Most dangerously, Empress Wang. A mainstream fact. Gao Zong's official wife, Empress Wang, had secured her position but failed to produce an heir. This was no small problem in the Tang court. Fertility wasn't just personal. It was political currency. A childless empress was vulnerable, and Wu Zhao, newly returned, saw the gap like a hawk spotting prey. At the same time, Consort Xiao, another favorite Gao Zong, had given him sons, making her a threat to Wang. The two women were already locked in rivalry, and Wu's arrival dropped fresh fuel on the fire. Wu Zhao didn't charge into the conflict head-on. She worked with quiet precision. She presented herself to Gao Zong as intelligent, supportive, someone who soothed his anxieties rather than burdened him. She read to him when his health faltered, offered advice when officials pressed too hard, and provided the warmth he didn't always find with his wife. But more than that, she understood the art of timing, when to speak, when to hold back, and when to let silence do the work. Here's a quirky tidbit. Empress Wang once tried to win Gao Zong's favor by introducing rare parrots to his gardens, birds trained to mimic human speech. Imagine the emperor laughing as a parrot squawked out phrases, only for Wu Zhao to later murmur something far more profound, making the parrot sound like noisy toys in comparison. Animals are fun, but clever words linger longer in an emperor's mind. Historians still argue whether Wu Zhao truly despised Empress Wang, or whether she simply saw her as a necessary obstacle. Either way, the rivalry soon became open. Wang, anxious about her lack of heirs, accused consort Xiao of arrogance. Xiao, smug with her sons, looked down on Wang, and between them moved Wu Zhao, who offered Gaozong not only companionship, but also her own children. That fact alone changed everything. Wu bore sons, a living claim to the future of the dynasty. Court gossip boiled. Ministers muttered behind sleeves. How could Gaozong favor a former concubine of his father? How could he risk scandal by elevating her? But scandal has a short memory in the face of charisma and competence. Wu Zhao didn't just charm Gaozong. She made herself indispensable. You, lying warm and drowsy, can almost hear the quiet steps of maids scurrying between chambers, carrying news like sparks. The emperor visited Wu Zhao again tonight. Wu's child has been born. The Empress is restless. Each whisper was another thread tightening around Empress Wang's fragile position. The palace must have felt like a chessboard in those days. Wang had the title. Xiao had the heirs. But Wu had the emperor's ear, and more dangerously, his trust. She gave him confidence, strengthened his decisions, and when officials pushed back, she taught him to resist. Slowly, subtly, she turned his reliance on her into a habit he couldn't break. And so, the rivalry hardened. Wang tried bribes, Xiao tried arrogance, but Wu Zhao's steady presence outmaneuvered them both. In a court where women were often dismissed as ornaments, she proved herself a strategist, not by shouting, not by clawing, but by planting seeds so carefully that by the time her rivals noticed, the garden was already hers. Historians still argue which moment finally tipped the balance, but the truth is, it wasn't one moment. It was dozens of small ones added together, like drops of water wearing down stone. Wu Zhao, the former nun, the concubine once forgotten, was now the rising tide, and both Empress Wang and consort Xiao stood directly in its path. As you close your eyes, picture the three women in the same palace hall. Wang with her jeweled crown, Xiao with her smug smile, and Wu Zhao with calm eyes that revealed nothing but promised everything. The emperor glanced at them all, but it was Wu's gaze he returned to, and in that small, silent choice, the shape of history bent. The palace whispers grow darker now, carrying stories that still make historians tilt their heads and frown. This is the infamous infant scandal, a tale soaked in tragedy, rumor, and political weaponry. You're lying in bed, heavy-eyed, and you can feel the chill of this part of Wu Zhao's journey. It's less silk and poetry, more shadows and accusation. A mainstream fact. Wu Zhao bore children for Emperor Gaozong, something Empress Wang could not. This gave Wu an edge in the rivalry, but it also made her dangerous. Every son she delivered was a reminder that Wang's womb remained empty, and every baby tightened Wu's hold on the throne's future. Then, in 654, disaster struck. One of Wu's infant daughters died under mysterious circumstances. The official story, preserved in harsh court chronicles, accused Wu of the unthinkable, that she herself killed her baby, then framed Empress Wang for the crime. The tale goes like this. Wu, knowing the emperor would be horrified by such cruelty, laid the lifeless child in Wang's quarters. When Gaozong discovered the scene, suspicion fell squarely on his wife, who already feared Wu's rising influence. The emperor, devastated and furious, turned against Wang. Historians still argue whether this ever happened. Some believe the story was fabricated centuries later by Confucian historians eager to paint Wu as a monster. Others think it was plausible. After all, palace politics could be brutal, and Wu had already proven she was capable of calculated moves. But the truth is lost in incense smoke. Was it murder, accident, or myth? No one can say with certainty. Here's a quirky tidbit to pull you from the darkness for a moment. Tang women often use talismans sewn into their babies' clothes to ward off evil spirits. Tiny embroidered charms, tigers, cranes, or coins, were thought to protect fragile lives. You can imagine Wu Zhao carefully pinning such charms on her child, even as the court later insisted she had orchestrated harm. The contrast makes the scandal even murkier. What matters is the fallout. Empress Wang, already weak in position, suddenly found herself accused of the worst crime imaginable, harming an imperial heir. Gaozong's trust in her shattered. Ministers who once supported her began to withdraw, and Wu Zhao, whether orchestrator or victim of rumor, emerged stronger. Life in the palace during those days must have been suffocating. You picture Empress Wang pacing her chamber, frantic, protesting her innocence to deaf ears. Consort Xiao, smug but uneasy, sensed that her turn might come next. Wu Zhao, outwardly calm, moved through the halls with measured grace, eyes lowered, voice steady. Whether or not she committed the act, she carried herself as though destiny itself was on her side. The emperor's grief only deepened his reliance on Wu. She became his solace, his comfort, and his trusted confidant. The death of her child, real, imagined, or manipulated, was transformed into a weapon that cut down her rivals. And as you drift under your blanket, the moral fog thickens. Was Wu Zhao a grieving mother unfairly smeared by jealous courtiers? Was she a strategist cold enough to sacrifice her own blood for the throne? Historians still argue, and maybe they always will. But what's clear is that after the scandal, the balance of power shifted irreversibly. The palace, once filled with parrots and poetry, now trembled under suspicion. Every glance between women carried venom. Every whisper might mean ruin. Wu Zhao, for all her calm exterior, surely knew the risks, but she also knew the rewards. One rival's reputation had been cracked beyond repair, and the path forward widened. So you, half asleep now, imagine the emperor holding Wu Zhao's hand, promising her justice, while Empress Wang sat alone, condemned by shadows she could not dispel. In the silence of that moment, the Tang court tilted, and Wu Zhao's rise sharpened into inevitability. The palace feels like a pressure cooker now. Steam hissing, tension thick, and everyone waiting to see who would burst first. Wu Zhao had already shifted the balance with the infant scandal, and now came the moment when her two main rivals, Empress Wang and Consort Xiao, faced the sharp edge of her ambition. What had been a rivalry of whispers was about to turn into a downfall loud enough to echo across centuries. A mainstream fact. By the mid-650s, Emperor Gaozong had lost nearly all faith in Empress Wang. She had failed to provide an heir. She had tangled herself in the accusations over the infant's death, and she seemed politically weak compared to Wu Zhao. Consort Xiao, despite having sons, was also losing favor. Gaozong was increasingly captivated by Wu's intelligence and steady support. The emperor began considering the unthinkable, deposing his official wife and elevating Wu to empress. Of course, such a move required more than whispers in bedchambers. It needed political justification. Wu Zhao and her allies began a careful campaign to paint Wang and Xiao as unfit. Rumors of arrogance, cruelty, and disloyalty spread to the palace like smoke seeping under doors. By the time Gaozong raised the issue formally, the court was already primed to accept the narrative. Here's a quirky tidbit. Palace punishments for disfavored empresses often involve humiliation rather than execution. Some were locked in small chambers with no attendants, forced to live in silence. Others were reduced to the rank of commoner and sent away. Imagine Empress Wang, once crowned with jade and gold, stripped of her ornaments, left sitting on a bare floor, staring at the cracks in the wall. Historians still argue about Wu Zhao's direct role in orchestrating the final blows. Did she personally push Gaozong to depose Wang and Xiao, or did the emperor act of his own will, desperate to free himself from a barren marriage? Either way, Wu Zhao's fingerprints are all over the outcome. By 655, Gaozong formally demoted both women and raised Wu Zhao to the title of Empress. The downfall itself was brutal. Wang and Xiao were accused of witchcraft and other crimes. Charges that ensured their removal carried a veneer of legitimacy. Wu Zhao, calm and composed, presided over their decline with the serenity of someone arranging furniture in a room. Everything exactly in its place. You, drowsing as you listen, might picture the palace that day. Wang and Xiao dragged in their chambers, their cries muffled by the heavy silence of courtiers too frightened to intervene. Eunuchs stripped their titles, scribes recorded the decrees, and Gaozong sat with downcast eyes, as if ashamed but resolute. And in the shadows, Wu Zhao's rise was complete. Here's where the historians disagree most fiercely. Some chronicles, written by Confucian scholars who despise female power, paint Wu Zhao as monstrous, gleefully engineering her rivals' deaths. Others suggest Gaozong himself ordered the executions, and Wu merely reaped the benefits. What we know for sure is that both Wang and Xiao were eliminated, leaving Wu unchallenged as Empress, a quirky footnote. Later rumors claim Wu had Wang and Xiao mutilated before their deaths, legend so lurid that even sympathetic historians roll their eyes. Whether true or propaganda, these stories fed into Wu's enduring image as ruthless. But remember, palace politics were rarely clean. Men who eliminated rivals by sword or poison were praised as strong rulers, while women doing the same were condemned as cruel. And so, the palace changed again. Wu Zhao moved into the Empress's chambers, draped in silks of crimson and gold, attended by ranks of servants who bowed at every word. She now walked the same halls she had once entered as a minor concubine. But this time the courtiers lowered their eyes not out of courtesy, but out of fear and respect. You roll over in bed, imagining that transformation. The girl who once folded robes now commanded who wore them. The woman who once dusted scrolls now issued decrees sealed with the imperial stamp. Empress Wang and Consort Xiao had fallen, and Wu Zhao stood alone at Gaozong's side. Historians still argue whether she felt triumph, relief, or simple inevitability. But one thing is certain. The path to absolute power was no longer a dream. It had begun in earnest. The throne room feels heavier now, its silence broken only by the rustle of silk as Wu Zhao takes her seat beside Emperor Gaozong, not as a concubine, not as a rival in waiting, but as the Empress of the Tang dynasty. After years of whispers, rumors, and ruthless maneuvering, she had claimed the dragon-embroidered position that once seemed unthinkable. You picture her robe sweeping across jade tiles, the golden phoenix crown glinting in torchlight, and her eyes calm but unyielding. A mainstream fact. In 655 CE, Wu Zhao was officially installed as Empress. Gaozong, besotted and increasingly dependent on her, made the choice despite fierce opposition from Confucian officials who declared it immoral for a son to elevate his father's concubine. But the emperor overruled them. Wu Zhao, who had once folded Taizong's robes in silence, was now the most powerful woman in China. And yet, the coronation wasn't only silk and ceremony. The court buzzed with unease. Ministers muttered about broken tradition, rival families braced for demotion, and Confucian moralists sharpened their pens for future histories. Wu Zhao knew the throne beneath her was cushioned with suspicion. She had to secure her position, not just by charm, but by competence. Her first moves as empress were measured but clear. She rewarded loyal allies, demoted officials who opposed her, and began inserting her influence into state decisions. While Gaozong technically remained emperor, Wu quickly positioned herself as his closest advisor. She wasn't content to simply embroider in the women's quarters. She wanted her hands on the levers of power. Here's a quirky tidbit. Tang empresses traditionally participated in elaborate rituals to symbolize harmony between heaven and earth. Wu Zhao, when performing these rites, reportedly added flourishes that emphasize her authority. Some accounts even claim she adjusted her robes to display dragon motifs more prominently, designs usually reserved for emperors. A tiny visual rebellion, but one noticed by everyone in the hall. Historians still argue whether Wu Zhao's rise at this point was driven by Gaozong's love or her own cunning. Was she simply the emperor's favorite, lucky to be loved, or was she orchestrating events, subtly bending him to her will? The truth probably lies in between. Gaozong was indecisive, prone to illness, and Wu filled the vacuum with skill. Love opened the door, but ability kept her there. Court life under Empress Wu changed tone. Ministers quickly realized they couldn't ignore her. Decisions once funneled only through the emperor now passed through her as well. She listened carefully in audiences, asked sharp questions, and remembered details. Imagine the discomfort of seasoned officials, men who had served under Taizong, suddenly being challenged by a woman who not only kept pace with their arguments but often outmaneuvered them. You, dozing off now, can almost hear the shuffle of their robes, the nervous clearing of throats, the endless yes, your majesty, uttered through clenched teeth. At home, Wu Zhao nurtured her image as the perfect partner. She bore Gaozong more children, strengthening her claim as mother of the dynasty's heirs. She managed the palace with efficiency, ensuring rituals were conducted flawlessly, and that court gossip increasingly painted her as both intelligent and divinely favored. Buddhism, too, became a tool. She sponsored temples and positioned herself as a protector of the faith, planting the idea that her rule had celestial approval. Still, threats lingered. Families allied with Wang and Xiao simmered with resentment. Confucian scholars wrote essays condemning female rule, even if they cloaked the criticism in vague references to upsetting the natural order. Wu Zhao responded not with tantrums, but with meticulous preparation. Every gesture, every word, was part of the slow construction of her fortress of legitimacy. So here you are, tucked under blankets, imagining the scene. Empress Wu seated beside Gaozong on the throne platform, courtiers bowing so low their foreheads touched the tiles. The air smells of sandalwood, drums beat softly in the background, and banners sway in the torchlight. Outwardly, she is the dutiful consort. Inwardly, she knows the game has changed forever. The woman who once folded robes has claimed the dragon seat of Empress. And deep inside, she must already be whispering to herself, "This is only the beginning." The torches flicker in the grand halls, and you sense a shift as Wu Zhao, now Empress Wu, begins to stretch her influence beyond the silken curtains of the inner palace. She no longer limits herself to serving tea at banquets or arranging flowers for ceremonies. Now she sits close to Emperor Gaozong, offering counsel, shaping policy, and, slowly but surely, guiding the empire with her steady hand. A mainstream fact. Emperor Gaozong was known for being indecisive and plagued by frequent illness, particularly debilitating headaches and bouts of weakness. Ministers often found him hesitant, overwhelmed by the weight of governance. Into that void stepped Wu Zhao. She listened to court debates, whispered advice to the emperor, and sometimes even issued instructions on his behalf. Soon, her voice became the one officials feared most in the audience chamber. Her rivals, those who had once sneered at her as a low-born concubine, now had to bow and call her Huangho, the Empress. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply held her position with calm assurance. And every decree Gaozong signed with her input only deepened her authority. Here's a quirky tidbit. Wu Zhao reportedly introduced new palace regulations for dress and etiquette that subtly emphasized her supremacy. Ladies-in-waiting were instructed to wear hairpins and styles that symbolize phoenixes, the traditional emblem of empresses. And rumor has it she had a habit of correcting ministers' calligraphy on memorials before handing them to the emperor. Imagine being a seasoned scholar, submitting a carefully written petition, only to have the empress mark it with, "Stroke order wrong. Try again." Historians still argue whether Wu Zhao dominated Gaozong, or whether he willingly leaned on her strength. Some portray him as a puppet dangling on her strings, while others argue he simply relied on her, as any ruler might rely on a competent partner. Either way, the result was the same. Empress Wu's hand guided the rudder of state. Court politics grew tense. Conservative ministers bristled at her interference, muttering that a woman's place was behind curtains, not in government. But Wu Zhao had already mastered the art of appearing modest while wielding power. She framed her advice as wifely devotion. She wasn't seizing authority. She was helping her ailing husband. The Confucianists could frown all they wanted. Gaozong's reliance on her was plain. And you, lying in the dark, can picture their private evenings. Gaozong, slumped with a headache, rubbing his temples. Wu Zhao, seated beside him, soothing his pain with herbal compresses while gently steering the conversation. Perhaps this official should be reassigned. Perhaps this tax should be adjusted. By the time his pain eased, the decision was already made, and it was hers. Outside the palace, the empire still pulsed with life. Merchants hawking wares, poets scribbling verses, farmers watching the skies for rain. But inside, the balance of power tilted more each day toward Wu Zhao. Ministers noticed. Some adapted, flattering her openly, while others resisted, whispering that this was dangerous precedent. Still, one by one, her suggestions turned into policies, her whispers into commands. The court, whether it liked it or not, began orbiting around her. Here's another detail to lull you deeper. Gaozong's illnesses sometimes kept him bedridden for days. In those moments, Wu Zhao held audiences in his name, receiving reports from officials. issuing decisions under the pretense of relaying his wishes. The officials knew, of course, but few dared challenge her. It was like watching the moon slowly eclipse the sun, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Historians still argue whether this was the true start of Wu Zhao's reign, the moment when she transitioned from empress to de facto ruler. But the debates don't change the reality. While Gaozong sat with aching temples, Wu Zhao built her empire one decision at a time. And so, as you drift further towards sleep, you imagine her seated in the hall of state, her robes arranged perfectly, her voice calm and measured, while ministers bow reluctantly. The emperor may still wear the dragon crown, but everyone in the room knows whose shadow stretches longest across the tiles. The palace corridors echo differently now, less like a cage and more like a council chamber. Wu Zhao, as empress, no longer waits passively. She acts, and her actions send ripples through the empire. Tonight you slip into the court with her, where alliances are forged with smiles and destroyed with a single word, where ministers bow deeply while silently sharpening their knives. A mainstream fact. Wu Zhao's growing influence put her in direct conflict with many of Gaozong's ministers. The Tang bureaucracy was filled with men loyal to Confucian ideals, men who believed firmly that women had no place in governance. Figures like Chancellor Shangguani criticized her openly, warning that her interference would destabilize the dynasty. To them, every decree she touched was a threat to the natural order. Wu Zhao, however, didn't respond with tantrums. She played the long game. She knew the court was a theater, and she learned her lines better than anyone. When ministers opposed her, she let Gaozong take the heat publicly, then whispered in his ear later about which officials to trust and which to demote. Slowly, her rivals were pushed to the margins. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Tang court had a tradition of heated debates where ministers could openly criticize the emperor without immediate punishment. Imagine Wu Zhao sitting serenely beside Gaozong during one of these sessions, listening to a minister rant about female interference, while she calmly examined her fingernails, pretending not to hear. Later, that same minister might find himself reassigned to a distant province with a climate suspiciously perfect for malaria. Historians still argue whether Gaozong was a mastermind behind these moves, or whether Wu Zhao's influence was decisive. Some claim Gaozong was not as weak as later accounts suggest, pointing out that he removed officials on his own initiative. Others insist Wu Zhao carefully orchestrated events, using her husband's authority as a shield for her ambitions. Either way, the purge of opponents began in earnest. Court intrigue became constant. Allies of Empress will receive promotions, new titles, and honors. Her enemies faced accusations of corruption, treason, or worse. Accusations didn't always need proof. Suspicion alone could sink a career. And through it all, Wu Zhao kept her composure. She knew how to appear gentle in public, even as her political claws worked in the shadows. You, drifting in your bed, can imagine the tension in those gilded halls. Ministers bowing, voices trembling as they addressed Gaozong, their eyes darting sideways toward the Empress who never missed a word. One wrong phrase, one misjudged tone, and careers could vanish overnight. Wu Zhao also cultivated new allies. She supported scholars and officials who came from less prestigious backgrounds, men who owed their rise to her favor rather than old aristocratic clans. This move not only strengthened her base, but also weakened the entrenched noble families who despised her. She was rewriting the rules of power, one appointment at a time. And yet, danger always lurked. The more powerful she became, the bolder her enemies grew in their conspiracies. Some whispered of removing her altogether, restoring Empress Wang's family influence, or replacing Gaozong with a stronger heir. But Wu Zhao was always one step ahead. By the time a plot reached whispers, she had already tightened the net. Here's another odd but telling image. Records say Wu sometimes used coded language in poetry and religious texts to signal her legitimacy, embedding her authority into culture itself. Imagine her commissioning a verse that looked like praise for a Buddha, but doubled as a message about her divine right to rule. Ministers scoffed at her boldness, but they couldn't challenge the piety without looking unfaithful themselves. Historians still argue whether Wu Zhao was ruthless out of necessity or out of nature. Was she simply protecting herself in a system designed to destroy ambitious women? Or did she relish the elimination of rivals? The The debate is endless, but one thing is clear. She survived where others did not. And so, in the candlelit chambers of the Tang court, Wu Zhao solidified her place. Her husband wore the crown, but she steered the empire's wheel, guiding it through storms of jealousy and rebellion. You close your eyes, imagining the scene. Wu Zhao seated at Gaozong's side, her face calm, her words precise, while ministers sweat under the weight of her gaze. The empire still calls her Empress, but the truth hums beneath the surface. She is already becoming something more. The palace air thickens with incense and unease, because Gaozong's health, never steady, begins to falter more seriously now. His headaches return like unwelcome guests, and fainting spells leave courtiers whispering in panic. You watch Wu Zhao adjust her robes, moving smoothly into the space left by her husband's weakness, like water filling the cracks of stone. A mainstream fact. Emperor Gaozong suffered a series of strokes in the late 660s, which left him partially paralyzed and increasingly dependent on others. The official records describe his illnesses as recurring wind disorders, an old medical term often linked to strokes or neurological problems. Whatever the diagnosis, the effect was clear. He could not always govern. Wu Zhao stepped into that gap, taking audiences in his name, issuing decrees, and consulting ministers directly. Picture the scene, Gaozong reclining in his chamber, his voice faint, while Wu Zhao sits upright beside him, listening as officials present petitions. At first, she relays his decisions, like an interpreter for a fading emperor. But over time, her own judgment slips into the answers. Ministers bow, pretending not to notice a shift, though everyone feels it. Here's a quirky tidbit. Tang physicians sometimes prescribe odd remedies for stroke patients, like drinking warm turtle blood or wearing charms inscribed with protective spells. You can imagine Wu Zhao standing by as Gaozong dutifully swallowed a cup of questionable medicine, while she silently planned tax reforms. Superstition and statecraft mixed awkwardly in the sick room. Historians still argue whether Gaozong welcomed Wu's growing control or resented it. Some sources claim he was relieved, grateful for her competence as his health failed. Others suggest he was uneasy, aware he was being overshadowed. Either way, Wu Zhao filled the void, and the machinery of empire continued without pause. She also used these years to tighten her network. She rewarded loyal ministers, advanced scholars from modest families, and strengthened the role of examinations in selecting officials. The old aristocrats grumbled, but Wu Zhao's reforms gave her new allies who saw their fortunes rise under her influence. Step by step, she built a bureaucracy that owed its loyalty not to Gaozong's lineage, but to her hand. Meanwhile, rituals of care masked the reality of power. You, lying in your bed now, can imagine the quiet evenings. Wu Zhao mixing herbal compresses, pressing them against Gaozong's temples while softly discussing policy. Perhaps we should strengthen the frontier, she might murmur. Perhaps that minister has grown unreliable. Between sighs of pain, Gaozong would nod. And with each nod, Wu Zhao's voice became the empire's voice. The palace staff knew. Eunuchs whispered about how audiences now address Wu as much as the emperor. Courtiers lowered their eyes, acknowledging silently that authority had shifted. By the late 660s, Empress Wu wasn't just helping Gaozong. She was ruling through him. And here's the strange duality. In public ceremonies, Gaozong still wore the dragon crown, his image presented as strong and divine. But behind the scenes, it was Wu Zhao who decided which provinces needed attention, which generals deserved promotion, which temples should be built. The empire became a stage play, where Gaozong played the lead, but Wu wrote the script. Historians still argue if this was the moment she crossed from influence into de facto rule. Some mark it as the birth of the two sages arrangement, where Wu and Gaozong were said to govern together, like a dual sun and moon. Others insist it was more one-sided, with Wu increasingly acting alone. Whatever the case, the dynasty's pulse beat to her rhythm. So you drift deeper into your pillow, picturing Wu Zhao at the emperor's bedside, calm, precise, unshaken by his decline. Around her, ministers bow and scribes record decrees, pretending the emperor still commands. But everyone knows whose hand steadies the empire now. The palace grows quieter still, muffled by the emperor's weakened voice and the empress's sharpened presence. Gaozong drifts in and out of illness, while Wu Zhao leans forward, taking on responsibilities that stretch far beyond the domestic role Confucian ideals would have assigned her. This is where she first tastes what it means to rule directly, not just advising, not just whispering, but issuing commands that shape the empire. A mainstream fact. By the 660s, Wu Zhao was effectively acting as regent in all but name. She reviewed memorials, heard petitions, and even held audiences with ministers when Gaozong's health failed. Some officials began referring to the arrangement as the two sages system, suggesting that both emperor and empress shared in governance. It was unprecedented, and though Gaozong's seal still ratified decrees, Wu's judgment lay behind them. Imagine the daily rhythm. Ministers filing into a chamber expecting to see the emperor, only to find Wu Zhao seated beside him, poised with an expression that gave away nothing. A memorial is read aloud about tax shortages in the provinces. Gaozong shifts uncomfortably on his couch, too weary to speak. Wu Zhao clears her throat, asks pointed questions, and then announces a decision. The ministers bow, their foreheads pressed to the cold tiles, knowing full well whose word carried weight. Here's a quirky tidbit. Wu Zhao reportedly introduced reforms in palace dining, insisting on healthier meals for Gaozong, less rich meat, more vegetables and grains. Some courtiers joked that while the emperor's appetite shrank, the empress's authority fattened daily. You can almost picture her serving him a bowl of millet porridge, sliding across the table with one hand while signing off on edicts with the other. Historians still argue how much resistance she faced at this stage. Some records claim conservative officials continued to push back, try to remind Gaozong of proper order. Others suggest many ministers were relieved to deal with Wu, recognizing her clarity and decisiveness compared to the emperor's hesitations. In truth, it was probably both. Whispers of unease in some halls, grudging respect in others. The empire itself kept moving. Armies marched on the frontiers. Canals carried grain. Poets composed verses that fluttered on silk fans. Yet inside the palace, Wu Zhao was setting new precedents. She ordered investigations into corruption, supervised temple constructions, and rewarded officials who demonstrated loyalty to her rather than to entrench noble clans. Each move was both administrative and symbolic, proof that she wasn't a temporary substitute, but a ruler in practice. At night, when the candles burned low, she sat with Gaozong in private. He, weary from illness, might have leaned against cushions while she read reports aloud. This province lacks grain reserves, she would note. This general requests reinforcements. Gaozong, half drifting, would murmur assent, and Wu Zhao would write the orders. By morning, they would be carried out as imperial will. The palace staff, of course, noticed. Eunuchs whispered to each other that the empress's voice was clearer than the emperor's. Ladies in waiting observed how ministers bowed slightly deeper when addressing her. And somewhere in the back corridors, ambitious men and women began asking themselves a dangerous question. What if she isn't just helping? What if she's becoming something more? Another quirky image drifts in. Wu Zhao was said to favor using screens decorated with phoenix motifs when receiving audiences. The phoenix, symbol of the Empress, slowly began appearing in more places, sometimes overshadowing the dragon, symbol of the Emperor. It was a subtle, visual reminder that balance in the empire was shifting. Historians still argue whether Gaozong felt threatened by this, or whether he quietly accepted it. Some sources claim he resented her dominance, but lacked the will to oppose it. Others suggest he genuinely trusted her, preferring to leave matters in her capable hands. Whatever his feelings, the reality remained. Wu Zhao had tasted direct power, and the taste was intoxicating. And you, lying under your blanket, can feel the inevitability of it. Once someone learns they can steer the ship, they don't return to being a passenger. Wu Zhao's decrees, whisper at first, now rang out across the empire. The woman who once folded robes now unfolded entire provinces in her palm. The palace drums beat faintly in the distance, and the empire feels different now. Less the reign of Gaozong, more the reign of Gaozong and Wu together, though everyone knew which half of that pairing carried more weight. You follow Wu Zhao as she steps fully into machinery of government. Where the stakes are higher, the rivals sharper, and her grip on power steadier. A mainstream fact. By the late 660s, the two sages system was fully in place. Edicts were issued jointly in the names of Gaozong and Wu Zhao, an unprecedented arrangement in Chinese history. While earlier empresses had influenced policy from behind curtains, Wu's role was open and unmistakable. Ministers addressed both of them during audiences, and courtiers quickly learned that Wu's questions were the ones that mattered. Imagine the scene. A minister kneels, presenting a memorial about unrest in a border province. Gaozong coughs, his voice faint. Wu Zhao leans forward, her tone calm but precise. How many troops are stationed there? What supplies are needed? The minister stammers answers, sweat forming on his brow. Gaozong nods weakly, but it is Wu who declares the final judgment. The decree is written down as though from both rulers. But every official in the hall knows whose decision it truly was. Here's a quirky tidbit. Wu Zhao supposedly disliked the habit of courtiers exaggerating in flowery language when writing reports. She insisted on clarity and conciseness, preferring facts over flattery. Ministers who delivered petitions dripping with metaphors about clouds of virtue and rivers of benevolence often found them tossed aside. Imagine the embarrassment of the scholar who spent all night crafting poetic flattery, only for Wu to remark dryly, "Yes, but how many bags of grain do we actually have?" Historians still argue whether Wu Zhao's growing power was tolerated out of necessity or genuine respect. Some believe officials bowed only because Gaozong's frailty left them no choice. Others argue Wu impressed even her critics with her efficiency and sharp intellect. Either way, resistance quieted as her competence became undeniable. But her rise was not without risk. The families of the deposed Empress Wang and consort Xiao still smoldered with resentment. Old aristocrats muttered in tea houses about the unnaturalness of a woman sharing power. And Confucian scholars, wielding pens as sharp as swords, wrote treatises warning that Yin female, energy upsetting the balance of Yang male, would doom the dynasty. Wu Zhao read these critiques, filed them away, and kept building her power brick by brick. In the meantime, she expanded her base of support. She promoted capable officials from families outside the entrenched elite, men who owed their success to her patronage rather than lineage. She commissioned Buddhist temples and sponsored scholars, weaving her image into both faith and culture. Step by step, she wasn't just exercising power. She was making it legitimate. At home, her role as mother also reinforced her authority. She had borne Gaozong's sons and daughters, and their presence in the palace halls served as proof that her line could continue the dynasty. Every cradle rocked by a nursemaid in her wing of the palace was a quiet political statement. The future Tang ran through her bloodline. You, half drifting in bed, can almost hear the rustle of her silk as she walks through audience halls, the clink of jade bracelets against her wrist as she unfurls memorials, the whisper of eunuchs announcing, "Her Majesty will see you now." The atmosphere is no longer one of doubt. It is one of inevitability. Here's another quirky image. Wu Zhao was said to have enjoyed debating ministers directly, sometimes asking trick questions about history to test their knowledge. Picture the horror of a scholar, expecting only to address the emperor, suddenly being quizzed by the empress herself on the Han dynasty's tax codes. Failed the test, and your career shrank like a candle in the wind. Historians still argue whether Gaozong himself ever regretted letting her power grow so openly. Some sources describe him as content, relieved to lean on her strength. Others hint that he felt overshadowed, trapped by her competence. But in either case, the empire no longer revolved around him alone. So you drift further into sleep, imagining the court bowing in unison, not to one dragon throne, but to two figures side by side. Outwardly, Gaozong is still emperor. Inwardly, every official knows the truth. The Tang dynasty's destiny is already being written by Empress Wu. The palace shadows stretch longer, and the empire leans ever more heavily on Wu Zhao's steady hand. Gaozong still wears a dragon crown, but illness gnaws at him, and his hesitations leave space that Wu fills with precision. Tonight, you settle into the tale of how she tightened her grip, not just over Gaozong, but over the entire structure of Tang governance. A mainstream fact. By the early 660s, Wu Zhao was no longer simply empress in the ceremonial sense. She had begun to attend councils of state, sitting behind a curtain at first, then beside Gaozong openly, Ministers were stunned, but none could ignore her presence. When Gaozong was struck with fainting spells or migraines, she stepped forward, receiving reports and issuing judgments. Her influence became so pervasive that contemporaries nicknamed her the Second Emperor. Imagine her routine. Dawn drums beat, officials line up with petitions, and Gaozong, pale and weary, reclines on cushions. Wu Zhao, composed, listens attentively. An official requests grain shipments to a drought-stricken province. Gaozong hesitates, his temples throbbing. Wu Zhao leans in, voice soft but decisive. Send 2,000 bushels from the capital reserves. The scribe records it as imperial will. Outside the chamber, no one dares whisper who truly made the call. Here's a quirky tidbit. Wu Zhao supposedly had a fondness for keeping parrots near her study, birds that mimic voices. Eunuchs joke nervously that even the parrots seem to recite edicts in her tone. Picture a brightly feathered bird squawking. Promote him to prefect. While ministers exchange uneasy glances, wondering if mockery might cost them their careers. Historians still argue whether Gaozong was comfortable with her dominance. Some chronicles insist he welcomed her aid, grateful for her competence while his health declined. Others suggest he resented her shadow, yet lacked the strength to oppose it. Either way, the outcome was undeniable. The machinery of empire ran more smoothly under her guidance than under his. Wu Zhao didn't stop at running meetings. She began cultivating her image as a ruler blessed by heaven. Buddhism became her tool of legitimacy. She sponsored lavish temple constructions, donated silk and land, and promoted sutras that emphasized female divinity. The idea that a woman could embody cosmic authority, dangerous under strict Confucianism, suddenly found spiritual justification. Monks preached that Wu was a living manifestation of compassion, chosen by the Buddha to guide the people. Meanwhile, she refined her political tactics. Old aristocratic families still resisted her, sneering that her Wu clan was of lesser status. So she elevated talented men from humbler backgrounds, officials who owed their rise to her alone. Every new appointment shifted loyalty away from the entrenched elite and toward Wu's personal network. She was building a government that worked for her, not just a dynasty. You, drifting in your bed, can almost hear the murmurs of frustration in noble households. This empress she raised as commoners above us. But those murmurs faded when her appointees delivered results. Roads were repaired, tax revenue stabilized, and law enforcement strengthened. Even her enemies had to admit the empire seemed steadier under her hand. Here's another quirky image. Wu Zhao was said to keep careful records of who opposed her early on, noting names in a kind of mental ledger. Ministers joked nervously about ending up in her book of grudges. The joke, of course, wasn't very funny when some of them found themselves reassigned to remote provinces or stripped of rank. Historians still argue whether Wu Zhao acted primarily out of ambition or necessity. Did she seize power because Gaozong's weakness demanded it, or because she hungered for it regardless? Perhaps both. What matters is that by now, she had crossed the line from supportive consort to de facto ruler. And so, as you drift deeper into the night, picture the scene in the Hall of State. Gaozong reclining silently, Wu Zhao seated beside him, her eyes sharp as she questions ministers. Outside, banners flap in the wind, signaling continuity. Inside, everyone knows the dynasty has two emperors, one fading, one rising. The palace bells chime in the gray dawn, and Wu Zhao's shadow stretches longer across the empire. She is no longer only Gaozong's consort. She is his partner in rule, his shield, his substitute when illness silences him. The empire, though outwardly loyal to the emperor, increasingly moves to the rhythm of her voice. A mainstream fact. By the late 660s, the court began openly referring to Wu Zhao and Gaozong together as the heir shung, the two sages. This arrangement gave her near equal standing with the emperor in governance. Petitions addressed to the throne were often considered incomplete unless they included Wu Zhao's input, and officials carefully balanced their words, knowing she might be the one who actually read them first. Picture the audience hall. Gaozong slumps on cushions, pale and tired, while Wu Zhao sits straight-backed, jade ornaments glinting in the lamplight. Ministers kneel, reading reports in voices that tremble ever so slightly. Gaozong closes his eyes against the pain in his head. Wu Zhao leans forward, her tone calm but precise. This general will be promoted. That governor will be replaced. The scribe scratches ink across bamboo slips, sealing her words into law. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some records suggest Wu Zhao kept a small bronze mirror with her during audiences, glancing into it occasionally as officials spoke. To her, it symbolized clarity and reflection, but ministers whispered nervously that she was checking to see through their lies. Imagine the discomfort presenting a report while the Empress polished a mirror, as though she could peer straight into your thoughts. Historians still argue whether the two sages' arrangement was truly equal. Some claim Gaozong remained the dominant figure, with Wu acting more as regent during his bout of illness. Others insist Wu's influence eclipses entirely, making her the first real ruler, while Gaozong lingered as a figurehead. What no one disputes is that her voice now carried the authority of the Dragon Throne. Wu Zhao also understood the power of appearances. She sponsored massive Buddhist projects, commissioning new sutras that emphasized the legitimacy of female rule. Temples rang with chants praising the Empress as a manifestation of divine wisdom. Pilgrims carried home tales of visions, linking her with celestial favor. Every prayer at a monastery, every monk chanting her name, echoed her claim that her authority wasn't just political, it was cosmic. At the same time, she sharpened her grip on the palace. Eunuchs and ladies-in-waiting who served her loyally rose quickly in status. Those who hesitated found themselves dismissed. The harem itself became an extension of her power. Even the emperor's other consorts, once rivals, were forced to defer to her. She was no longer a player in the harem's games. She was a referee. You, half asleep now, can imagine her at night, seated by candlelight, reviewing reports while Gaozong drifts into uneasy sleep beside her. Outside, cicadas hum in the summer heat. Inside, the empire's fate rests on the brushstrokes she makes on paper, sealing orders that carry her authority across provinces and armies. Here's another quirky image. Wu Zhao was known for her sharp memory. Ministers dreaded audiences because she remembered every detail of past petitions. If someone contradicted themselves or exaggerated, she would call them out instantly. Imagine a courtier sweating as she says calmly, "Last spring, you claimed the harvest was abundant. Why do you now report famine?" The room would fall silent, the only sound the scratching of the scribe recording yet another career-ending mistake. Historians still argue about her motives during this stage. Was she content to share power, or was she already preparing to claim it fully for herself? The chronicles hint that she was both cautious and ambitious, building her legitimacy step by step, while letting tradition catch up to her reality. And so, as you sink deeper under your blanket, picture the Tang dynasty under two rulers seated side by side. One, frail and fading, the other, steady and sharp, her eyes reflecting the weight of the empire. The ministers bow, the drums beat, and the world turns, already belonging more to Wu Zhao than anyone else. The palace courtyard shimmer under morning light, banners fluttering in the breeze, and Wu Zhao's presence fills every corner like incense that lingers long after the censer has cooled. The two sages arrangement is no longer a novelty. It is the reality of Tang governance. Tonight, you let yourself wander through those years when Wu Zhao became, in practice if not in name, the empire's primary ruler. A mainstream fact. Wu Zhao began presiding over imperial audiences even when Gaozong was not visibly ill. At first, she stood beside him, relaying his words. Then, gradually, she held meetings on her own, issuing decisions that bore the emperor's seal. Memorials, tax reports, and military updates all passed through her hands. Ministers who tried to bypass her quickly learned that their petitions went unanswered. Imagine the frustration of an old aristocrat, beard trembling with outrage, as he presented a proposal directly to Gaozong, only to hear the emperor murmur, "My empress will review it." Then Wu Zhao's calm voice cut to the hall. "This is unwise. Adjust the figures." The aristocrat bows, seething but powerless. Here's a quirky tidbit. Wu Zhao was said to reward officials who demonstrated unusual diligence by sending them bolts of silk or jars of honey. The honey gift became a court joke. Sweet tokens from an empress whose words could otherwise sting like venom. Ministers joked nervously that you never knew which way you'd get, the honey jar, or the sting. Historians still argue whether Gaozong was complicit or passive. Some sources claim he preferred Wu's strength, feeling secure with her running the empire while he rested. Others insist he resented her dominance but lacked the will or allies to resist. Either way, his signature appeared on decrees shaped entirely by her judgment. Wu Zhao also began shaping the empire's narrative. She commissioned Buddhist texts that described the cosmic legitimacy of female rulers, subtly weaving theology into politics. Monks compared her to bodhisattvas, divine beings of compassion and wisdom. The message spread beyond the palace. This was no ordinary empress. This was heaven's chosen. Meanwhile, Wu tightened her grip on internal politics. She monitored court factions carefully, ensuring that no minister grew too powerful. When suspicions of disloyalty arose, she acted swiftly, demoting or exiling rivals. Eunuchs and palace attendants carried her whispers like arrows, striking unseen. Ministers learned to tread carefully, offering loyalty not just to Gaozong, but directly to her. You, lying beneath your blanket, can almost hear the shift in voices. His Majesty commands, slowly giving way to Her Majesty suggests. The difference was subtle at first, then unmistakable. And here's another quirky image. Wu Zhao was said to test the loyalty of officials by assigning them tasks in distant provinces, watching how they handled floods, famine, or border skirmishes. Those who succeeded returned with promotions. Those who failed vanished into obscurity. Imagine a young magistrate sweating over grain ledgers, whispering, "If I don't impress the Empress, I'm finished." Historians still argue if this stage was the true beginning of her reign. Some mark 660 CE as the moment she became the empire's real ruler. Others push it later, when Gaozong's illnesses worsened. But from the perspective of the ministers bowing each morning, the distinction hardly mattered. They already feared her gaze more than his. Wu Zhao, outwardly dutiful, still framed her authority as service to Gaozong. She reminded everyone that she was simply helping her husband in times of weakness. Yet beneath the careful language, her power was absolute. She could elevate or destroy careers with a word. She could direct armies, shift tax burdens, and command construction of temples that immortalized her name. So you drift deeper. Imagine the audience hall. Gaozong sitting silently, pale and tired, while Wu Zhao addresses a court with clear authority. Ministers bow, eunuchs scurry, scribes record. Outside, the banners ripple in the wind. Inside, the empire is already adjusted to a new rhythm, the steady voice of Empress Wu. The empire hums beneath Wu Zhao's fingertips now, and you sense how quickly her role expands from shared partner to commanding presence. The two sages system is no longer just a stopgap for Gaozong's health. It's the new reality of Tang governance. Ministers bow lower, whispers spread farther, and the Empress's influence seeps into every chamber, every scroll, every seal. A mainstream fact. By the early 670s, Wu Zhao was openly drafting and reviewing memorials before they ever reached Gaozong. Petitioners soon learned that if Wu disapproved, their request died quietly in the palace corridors. Gaozong's authority still shimmered like the dragon on his robes, but everyone knew decisions passed through Wu's hands first. Picture her chambers at dawn. Piles of bamboo slips and silk scrolls laid neatly on lacquered tables, candles guttering low after a night of study. Gaozong dozes on cushions, his headaches pressing like weights against his temples. Wu Zhao dips her brush, writes instructions in flowing calligraphy, and hands them to eunuchs, who hurry off to ministries. The empire turns, steady as the brush strokes of her pen. Here's a quirky tidbit. Wu Zhao supposedly enjoyed surrounding herself with screens painted with landscapes of mountains and rivers. She claimed it helped her see the empire while indoors. Ministers chuckled nervously at the symbolism. After all, the screens weren't just decoration. They were metaphors. She wasn't just looking at rivers and mountains. She was ruling them. Historians still argue whether Gaozong resented this or surrendered willingly. Some accounts say he leaned on her eagerly, relieved to let her shoulder the burden. Others suggest he sometimes snapped at her dominance, only to relent when illness weakened him again. Either way, her grip didn't loosen. Each decree she influenced reinforced her indispensability. Wu Zhao also sharpened her religious strategy. Buddhism, already popular in Tang China, became a stage for her legitimacy. She sponsored the writing of the Great Cloud Sutra, a text proclaiming that a female ruler would emerge as a divine savior to restore order. Monks preached it enthusiastically, linking Wu to prophecies of cosmic destiny. Suddenly, the notion of a woman wielding ultimate authority no longer seemed so strange. It seemed foretold. At the same time, she maneuvered against entrenched aristocrats. Powerful clans like the Lis and Yangs grumbled that the Empress was undermining tradition. Wu responded not with open confrontation, but with careful appointments. Talented men of lower birth rose swiftly under her patronage, grateful for her support. These officials became her loyal allies, a new class of administrators who owed their futures directly to her. You, drifting under the blanket, can almost hear the scratch of pens as ministers rewrote petitions overnight, removing flowery flattery and focusing on practical detail, hoping to please the Empress's sharp eye. Some succeeded and rose to glory. Others stumbled, tripped by their own arrogance, and vanished into exile. Another quirky image. Wu Zhao was said to test the loyalty of eunuchs by giving them impossible errands, like delivering messages across the city within absurdly short times. Those who returned sweaty but successful won her trust. Those who failed never saw her chambers again. It was a court of constant trial, where loyalty was tested not once, but daily. Historians still argue whether Wu Zhao's methods were ruthless or simply necessary. Could a woman have survived the Tang court without such vigilance? Or did she go further than survival, turning suspicion into an art form? The debate lingers, but the outcome is clear. She thrived. So you let your eyes grow heavier, imagining her in the Hall of State, the dragon throne beside her, Gaozong pale and silent. Ministers kneel, awaiting judgment. Wu Zhao's voice cuts through the incense-thick air, calm, precise, final. In that moment, the empire's destiny belongs not to the emperor who sits, but to the empress who speaks. The palace bells toll at dawn, but their echoes no longer sound like Gaozong summoned alone. They reverberate with Wu Zhao's authority. Each day now feels more like her reign than his, though the dragon crown still rests on his weary head. Ministers bow to both, but their eyes flicker toward the empress, measuring her expression more carefully than the emperor's words. A mainstream fact. Wu Zhao began to centralize power by creating new government offices and appointing loyal supporters, often from families outside the entrenched aristocracy. She elevated officials based on talent and loyalty rather than lineage, undermining the old aristocratic clans who viewed her as an intruder. This not only expanded her control, but also reshaped the Tang bureaucracy into a system that favored merit over birth. Imagine her reviewing candidates late at night, her brush gliding across memorials. Promote him to prefect. Reassign this one to the frontier. Gaozong, weary and half asleep, barely raises objections. By morning, the empire's leadership has shifted subtly in her favor, another stone laid in the foundation of her eventual rule. Here's a quirky tidbit. Wu Zhao was said to keep a small lapdog by her side during audiences, a fluffy companion that startled ministers by barking at inopportune moments. Superstitious courtiers whispered that the dog could sense disloyalty, and some even bowed lower when it growled. Imagine a dignified official, sweating as a tiny dog yapped his direction, while Wu Zhao's eyes lingered just long enough to make him squirm. Historians still argue whether Wu Zhao's reforms were driven by vision or paranoia. Was she sincerely building a more efficient, meritocratic government? Or was she simply stacking the bureaucracy with her allies to secure her throne? Likely both. Whatever her motives, the effect was profound. The empire grew increasingly reliant on her chosen officials, and her network spread across provinces like roots beneath soil. Meanwhile, Gaozong's health kept fading. His headaches grew sharper, his fainting spells more frequent. Ministers began referring to him less as the son of heaven, and more as the shadow of one. Wu Zhao stepped in with greater boldness, conducting audiences without him, stamping decrees with both their names, and speaking of policies as though they were her own. You, drifting in your bed now, can imagine the hushed atmosphere in the throne hall. Gaozong absent, Wu Zhao seated upright, her robes trailing like rivers of silk. Ministers kneel hesitant, then proceed to present petitions as though nothing is amiss. Her voice, calm and deliberate, fills the chamber. This tax shall be reduced. That general shall be recalled. By the end, no one even bothers to ask where Gaozong is. Another quirky image. Wu Zhao was meticulous about symbolism. She ordered that phoenix motifs, symbols of the Empress, be woven into palace banners and curtains, sometimes more prominently than the dragon. Imagine the sight. A hall where dragon and phoenix banners hung side by side, but the phoenix glowed brighter in torchlight. Ministers bowed, pretending not to notice the imbalance, while silently acknowledging the truth. Historians still argue whether this was the moment Wu Zhao first envisioned herself as emperor, not just empress. Some claim her ambitions had always pointed that way. Others believe the idea emerged only as Gaozong declined. What's certain is that she was no longer satisfied with shared power. She was already rehearsing for something greater. And so, as the night deepens around you, picture Wu Zhao pacing the palace corridors, her steps soft but her resolve loud. Gaozong sleeps fitfully in another chamber, but she is wide awake, shaping the empire with each decision. The ministers, the eunuchs, the generals, they all know who rules now. They may still call her empress, but in their hearts, they already bow to the emperor she is becoming. The palace gardens sway with the breeze, but the air inside the throne hall is tense, almost brittle, as Wu Zhao begins to test the boundaries of loyalty more openly. By now, everyone knows her authority is not borrowed from Gaozong. It is wielded in her own right. Ministers bow lower, speak slower, and glance carefully at one another before answering her sharp questions. A mainstream fact. During Gaozong's later years, Wu Zhao established secret police networks to monitor officials and courtiers. These agents, often eunuchs or lesser functionaries, reported whispers of dissent directly to her. The system frightened the old aristocracy, but also kept her rivals in check. Every murmur in a corridor, every sigh over tea, could find its way back to her ears. Imagine being a minister then, bowing during morning court, only to find that a casual comment you made last night about the Empress being too bold has already been repeated to her. The next day, you're reassigned to a remote province where bandits outnumber farmers. No swords were drawn, but your career was ended with a stroke of her brush. Here's a quirky tidbit. Wu Zhao supposedly kept files on key officials, not just their political leanings, but even details about their diets, habits, and superstitions. One minister who refused to eat garlic was suddenly served garlic-laden dishes at a banquet, leaving him sputtering while Wu Zhao observed calmly. It wasn't just governance. It was theater, and she directed every scene. Historians still argue whether the surveillance system was excessive paranoia or simply practical survival in a hostile court. Some view it as ruthless suppression, while others argue it was the only way a woman in her position could maintain power amid aristocrats who would have gladly erased her. Either way, her vigilance worked. Plots fizzled before they bloomed. Meanwhile, Gaozong's health continued to falter. At audiences, he sometimes fell silent halfway through a petition, eyes clouded with pain, and Wu Zhao stepped in smoothly, finishing his sentences. Ministers no longer flinched. They expected it. Gaozong might nod faintly, but Wu Zhao's words carried the weight. The transition from shared authority to near sole authority was complete in practice, even if not in name. Beyond politics, Wu Zhao carefully nurtured her public image. She commissioned inscriptions and Buddhist sutras that presented her as a divinely chosen leader. In temples, monks preached sermons about the prophecy of a female ruler destined to bring order and prosperity. Common people began hearing her name not just as empress, but as heaven's gift. You, lying comfortably now, can almost hear the bells of those temples ringing, the chanting of monks echoing across the countryside. Each tone reinforced the idea that Wu Zhao's power was not only permitted but ordained. Another quirky image. Wu Zhao reportedly enjoyed staging small debates between scholars in her private chambers, treating them almost like intellectual entertainment. She'd listen, interject sharp questions, and reward the sharper debater with gifts. Ministers dreaded being summoned, because winning impressed her, but losing could end a career. Imagine being a scholar, sweating under candlelight, debating grain tax policy while the Empress smirked faintly at your stumbling. Historians still argue whether Wu Zhao's reliance on surveillance and propaganda made her unpopular in her time, or whether resentment grew only later, when Confucian historians wrote their condemnations. Some evidence suggests that many common people admired her practical governance, even if elites bristled at her dominance. And so, the palace changes again. Wu Zhao is no longer just the empress who shares power with her husband. She has become the unseen net beneath the empire, catching every whisper, tugging every thread, directing every movement. Ministers bow to the emperor, but they fear the empress. As you close your eyes, you can picture it clearly. Wu Zhao seated calmly in the hall of state, Gao Zong pale and quiet beside her, while ministers kneel like reeds in a storm. Her gaze sweeps the chamber, and silence reigns. She doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't need to. The palace grows quieter with every passing season, not because fewer people live there, but because fewer dare to speak without glancing over their shoulders. Wu Zhao's system of surveillance and influence now blankets the court like an invisible net, and everyone inside it knows the strands tighten at her command. A mainstream fact. In the late 660s and early 670s, Wu Zhao began promoting a circle of loyal officials, men such as Su Jingzong and Li Yifu, who acted as her political enforcers. These ministers were mocked by aristocrats as opportunists, but their loyalty to Wu was unshakable. Through them, she issued policies, punished dissenters, and bypassed entrenched noble families. The court, once dominated by powerful clans, now answered to her hand-picked allies. Picture the scene, a morning audience, rows of ministers kneeling on cold tiles. Gao Zong sits pale and silent, his eyes heavy. Wu Zhao nods to one of her loyalists, who reads out a decree condemning a rival official for corruption. Gasps ripple through the hall. By evening, the rival is exiled to a desolate province, his estate confiscated. Wu doesn't raise her voice, but the empire shakes all the same. Here's a quirky tidbit. Wu Zhao reportedly kept lists of officials written on silk scrolls that she updated constantly, shifting names between categories like loyal, useful, and suspect. Some claim she even used different colored inks to mark them, as if color-coding her enemies and allies. Imagine a minister lying awake at night, wondering what color his name was inked in. Historians still argue whether her loyal ministers were competent statesmen or just sycophants. Critics accuse them of fawning obedience, while defenders note they carried out reforms that stabilized taxation and curbed corruption. Perhaps they were both. Opportunists who nonetheless kept the machinery of empire running under Wu's command. Meanwhile, Wu Zhao deepened her reliance on Buddhist symbolism. Temples displayed images of divine figures resembling her, and sutras proclaimed the prophecy of a woman ruler destined to bring order. Gao Zong may have still held the throne, but in temples and villages, the whispers grew. The Empress is the true power. You, lying drowsy in the quiet, can almost hear the chants of monks echoing through temple halls. Avalokiteshvara, Guanyin, the compassionate one. But some pilgrims mutter that compassion has the face of their empress. It's propaganda disguised as prayer, soft as incense, steady as stone. Another quirky image. Wu Zhao was rumored to test the ministers by asking them to critique poems she anonymously circulated in court. Those who praised the verses enthusiastically won her favor. Those who criticized too harshly discovered later that the Empress herself had written them. Picture a scholar blanching as he realizes his casual remark, clumsy phrasing, was about the ruler's own brushwork. Historians still argue whether Wu Zhao planned from the start to claim the throne herself, or if her ambition grew gradually as circumstances shifted. Was she always steering toward ultimate power, or did the emperor's decline and her enemies' hostility harden her resolve? Either way, the arc was bending toward one conclusion. She was no longer content with shared rule. And so, the palace became a theater of fear and inevitability. Eunuchs whispered in corridors, ministers watched their words, and noble clans lost ground daily. Wu Zhao sat serene, the phoenix beside the dragon, her gaze as steady as the empire's pulse. As you drift into deeper rest, picture her in her private chamber at night, candlelight flickering across silk scrolls covered in names, promotions, and dismissals. She dips her brush, adds one more stroke, and changes a man's life forever. Outside, the crickets hum. Inside, the empire bends to her pen. The palace walls seem to lean inward with the weight of silence, as if they too recognize that Gao Zong's reign is slipping further into shadow, while Wu Zhao's presence grows brighter, sharper, undeniable. It is no longer whispered who truly steers the empire. Everyone knows. Yet with growing power comes sharper resistance, and this is where Wu Zhao begins facing not just disapproval, but plots. A mainstream fact. In the 670s, opposition to Wu Zhao intensified among aristocrats and Confucian scholars. They accused her of overstepping tradition, of undermining the proper order where the emperor ruled and women stayed behind curtains. Some even plotted to restore influence to other branches of the royal family. But Wu Zhao had already built a surveillance state that sniffed out disloyalty before it could take root. Conspiracies fizzled, and their leaders were swiftly exiled or executed. Picture the moment. A minister kneels at dawn court, sweat glistening on his brow, as a decree is read accusing him of treasonous speech. His lips tremble. He had thought his words at last night's banquet were private. Guards drag him away, sandals scraping against jade tiles. Wu Zhao sits serene, her phoenix crown gleaming. No protest is spoken. Silence is safer. Here's a quirky tidbit. Wu Zhao was said to believe in omens, and once kept astrologers busy predicting favorable days for punishments. Imagine a condemned official waiting nervously while an astrologer declared, "The stars are unlucky today. Execution tomorrow instead." Even the cosmos, it seemed, bowed to her timetable. Historians still argue whether Wu Zhao exaggerated threats to justify purges, or whether her enemies truly were that numerous. Some chronicles describe her as ruthless, eliminating rivals for ambition alone. Others suggest her vigilance was necessary, since male courtiers would never have tolerated her dominance otherwise. Whatever the truth, the effect was clear. Her enemies dwindled, her allies multiplied. Meanwhile, Gao Zong's health worsened. Strokes left him frail, often unable to speak clearly. In those moments, Wu Zhao stepped forward fully, conducting state affairs as though the throne were already hers. Ministers addressed her directly, sometimes adding perfunctory bows toward Gao Zong, who sat in silence. The fiction of dual rule grew thinner by the day. You, lying under your blanket now, can almost hear the rustle of silk robes as Wu Zhao's loyal ministers shuffle petitions to her hand rather than his. The emperor's shadow grew fainter. The empress's voice filled the hall like steady drum beats. Another quirky image. Wu Zhao reportedly tested loyalty through small acts, like sending minor gifts, bolts of silk, trays of fruit, to officials and watching how quickly they responded with thanks. Those who delayed, even for practical reasons, found themselves marked as cold in loyalty. Imagine an official rushing through rain at night to deliver a thank you note, terrified that a late reply might cost him his post. Historians still argue whether Gao Zong himself approved of this tightening grip. Some say he surrendered gladly, relieved to let Wu govern while he declined. Others claim he occasionally rebelled, only to be soothed or overruled. But by now it hardly mattered. Wu Zhao had become the living pulse of Tang politics. And so, the empire adjusted. The people still spoke of Gao Zong as emperor. But it was Wu Zhao's edicts that reached the provinces, her policies that stabilized taxes, her appointments that shaped governance. The dynasty remained Tang in name, but in spirit, it was already hers. As you sink deeper into rest, picture Wu Zhao at night, seated by Gao Zong's bedside. He dozes in a haze, while she writes orders by candlelight. The brush strokes are steady, deliberate, reshaping an empire one decree at a time. Outside, the stars shine cold and distant. Inside, the future belongs to her. The palace feels like a stage where one actor has forgotten his lines, and another delivers them flawlessly. Gao Zong still wears a crown, but his words falter. Wu Zhao steps in, her voice steady, her judgment crisp. The ministers kneel, but their eyes slide toward her, not out of courtesy, but out of necessity. A mainstream fact. In the early 670s, Wu Zhao began issuing decrees in her own name alongside Gao Zong's. This practice made her authority visible on official documents. something no Tang Empress had done before. When orders reached provincial governors, they carried not just the dragon seal of the emperor, but also the mark of the Empress. Across China, the message was unmistakable. Governance came from both, though everyone knew whose pen was stronger. Imagine the courier arriving in a dusty frontier garrison, unrolling an edict that bore two seals. The soldiers bow, muttering, "From His Majesty and Her Majesty." But as the general studies the calligraphy, he notes the clear, confident hand of the Empress. In far-flung posts, whispers spread, "It is she who governs." Here's a quirky tidbit. Wu Zhao reportedly enjoyed reviewing tax records herself, sometimes pointing out arithmetic errors that clerks had missed. Officials dreaded her scrutiny more than the emperor's because she could calculate revenues with unnerving precision. Picture a minister flushing red as Wu Zhao calmly corrects his numbers, tapping the bamboo slip with her brush as if to say, "Try again." Historians still argue whether Wu Zhao's authority at this stage was a careful partnership or already a quiet usurpation. Some call it the peak of the two sages' arrangement, with both emperor and empress officially acknowledged as rulers. Others argue it was an early disguise for her eventual sole reign. Either way, the precedent was staggering. The Tang dynasty in all of Chinese history had never seen a woman exercise such overt political power. Wu Zhao also advanced reforms that reshaped the empire. She expanded the civil service examination system, allowing more men of modest backgrounds to compete for office. This not only weakened aristocratic dominance, but also gave her a pool of loyal officials whose success depended entirely on her. Meritocracy and ambition, woven together, became tools in her arsenal. You, drowsing under the sheets, can almost hear the scratch of brushes as hopeful scholars copied texts late into the night, dreaming that passing the examinations would raise them to court and into the Empress's favor. Their sweat and ink fueled her transformation of the bureaucracy. Another quirky image. Wu Zhao was rumored to reward exam candidates who impressed her not only with posts but also with personal audiences. Imagine a nervous young scholar, bowing so low his forehead bruises against the tiles, as the Empress herself quizzes him on history. A single sharp answer might change his life. A hesitation might end his career before it began. Historians still argue whether Wu Zhao pursued reforms out of genuine vision or pragmatic self-interest. Was she building a fairer system or simply constructing a loyal power base? Perhaps both. But what matters is the effect. Her hand reshaped the state to reflect her own strength. Meanwhile, Gaozong's decline accelerated. His fainting spells lengthened. His voice grew weaker. Rumors spread that he could no longer even sit through full audiences. Ministers bowed before the dragon throne. But when they raised their heads, it was Wu Zhao who gave the orders. So you drift further into sleep, imagining the throne hall. Incense rising in curling streams, courtiers kneeling in perfect rows. The emperor slumped against cushions, silent. Wu Zhao's phoenix crown gleams in the lamplight as she speaks clearly, her words carrying across the chamber. The scribes record, the eunuchs obey, the empire listens. The Tang dynasty remains in name. But in spirit, everyone already knows. The throne belongs to her.